Two lonely bear cubs. Beg this family to be let into the home. What this human baby did put everyone in tears. Let us know where you're watching from. If you love my content, consider supporting it with a super thanks. Every bit of your support helps us create even more amazing stories for you. The wind whispered through the tall pines as twilight settled over the forest. Inside their secluded cabin, Nathan and Olivia Bennett cradled their 9-month-old daughter Emma near the crackling fireplace. Outside, the first snowflakes of winter danced in the air. A beautiful yet solemn reminder that the harshest season was approaching. The family had moved to this remote location just 6 months earlier, seeking tranquility away from city life, but they were still adjusting to the untamed wilderness that surrounded their new home. "Do you hear that?" Olivia whispered, her body tensing as she clutched Emma closer to her chest. The baby's wide blue eyes stared back at her mother, unblinking and curious. Nathan paused, tilting his head. At first, there was only silence. Then came a soft, plaintive whimper from somewhere beyond their porch. It wasn't the howl of a wolf or the screech of an owl. This sound carried something else within it. Desperation. "Probably just the wind," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. The sound came again, higher pitched and more insistent, like a child crying out for help. Emma squirmed in her mother's arms, pointing her tiny finger toward the window. "Bah!" she babbled, the simple sound echoing in the quiet room. Nathan rose from his chair with reluctance, moving cautiously toward the front door. His hand hovered over the knob as another whimper, even more pitiful than the last, drifted through the cracks. Taking a deep breath, he flicked on the porch light and peered through the small window beside the door. What he saw made his blood run cold. 2 small black bears, no larger than medium-sized dogs, stood trembling on their hind legs before the door. Their fur was matted with mud and ice, and their eyes, large, frightened, and impossibly expressive, seemed to plead with him. One of the cubs favored its right front paw, holding it painfully above the wooden planks of the porch. The sight was so unexpected, so bizarre, that Nathan could only stare. "What is it?" Olivia called, still clutching Emma protectively. "Nathan, what's out there?" "Bears," he replied, his voice barely audible. "2 bear cubs. They're just standing there, looking at the door." Olivia's face paled. "The mother? Do you see the mother bear?" Nathan scanned the tree line, the darkness beyond their porch, the spaces between shadows. Nothing moved except the falling snow and the shivering cubs. "No sign of her," he said, his mind racing. They look abandoned, and one's hurt." As if understanding his words, the injured cub pressed its paw against the door, leaving a smudge on the glass. A soft whine escaped its throat, a sound so mournful it seemed to pierce the very air. "We can't let them in," Olivia said firmly, though her voice quavered. "They're wild animals, Nathan. What if the mother comes looking for them? What if they're dangerous?" "They're just babies," Nathan argued, watching as the cubs huddled closer together against the biting wind. "Something's wrong. Bears this young shouldn't be without their mother, especially with winter coming." Emma began to fuss, reaching her arms out toward the door as if she somehow knew what waited on the other side. Her little face scrunched up, not in fear, but in what almost looked like concern. "Bah," she said again, more insistently this time. "Bah." "She wants to see the baby bears," Nathan whispered, amazed at his daughter's intuition. A loud thump against the door made them both jump. The uninjured cub had reared up, placing both paws against the wood in what seemed like a deliberate knock. Its dark eyes stared directly at Nathan through the window. In that moment, something shifted in the atmosphere of the cabin, a change as tangible as the heat from the fire. These weren't just random animals seeking shelter from the cold. It felt like something had guided these cubs to their doorstep, something beyond explanation. "What should we do?" Olivia whispered, her resolve weakening as another pitiful cry came from the porch. Emma was now fully agitated, straining toward the door with surprising strength. Nathan looked from his wife and child to the desperate cubs outside. The right choice wasn't clear, but his heart pulled him toward compassion. "We need to help them," he said finally. "Just for tonight. We can call animal control in the morning." Olivia hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Be careful," she warned, moving to place Emma in her playpen several feet away from the door. Nathan grabbed a blanket from the couch, then slowly, cautiously, turned the lock and opened the door just a crack. The cubs froze, their dark eyes fixed on the sliver of warm light spilling onto the porch. For a breathless moment no one moved. Not Nathan, not the cubs, not even the wind seemed to stir. Then, with a gentle nudge of the door, Nathan created an opening just wide enough for the small bears to enter. "It's okay," he whispered, hardly believing what he was doing. "Come in from the cold." The cubs hesitated, their natural caution battling against their desperate need for warmth and safety. The injured one took the first tentative step forward, limping slightly as it crossed the threshold into the human dwelling. Its companion followed closely behind, their bodies pressed together for reassurance in this strange new territory. As the door closed behind them, sealing all 5 beings, 2 adults, 1 baby, and 2 bear cubs, inside the cabin, none of them could have possibly imagined how this extraordinary night would transform them all. The quiet tension in the room was thick enough to touch. Nathan and Olivia stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe as the bear cubs surveyed their surroundings with wary eyes. The injured cub trembled visibly, its hurt paw held carefully above the floor, while the other remained protective, staying between its sibling and the humans. "They're terrified," Olivia whispered, her maternal instincts gradually overcoming her fear. The cubs' ribs showed faintly beneath their dull fur, and their eyes held a haunted look that spoke of recent trauma. From her playpen, Emma watched the newcomers with rapt fascination. Unlike her parents, she showed no fear, only intense curiosity and something that looked remarkably like recognition. She babbled softly, her tiny hands gripping the edge of the playpen as she tried to pull herself up for a better view. "What happened to you two?" Nathan murmured, kneeling slowly to appear less threatening. "Where's your mama?" As if understanding his question, the healthier cub let out a low, mournful sound that sent chills down both adults' spines. In that single, sorrowful note, they sensed a story of loss and desperation that needed no translation. "I think," Olivia's voice caught, "I think something happened to their mother." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Orphaned cubs rarely survived a winter, especially one as young and harsh as this one promised to be. Emma began bouncing excitedly in her playpen, making the little structure rock slightly. Her joyful sounds drew the cubs' attention, and to the parents' astonishment, both bears turned toward the baby with visible interest. Their ears perked forward, and their postures relaxed slightly, as if the presence of another young creature reassured them. "They're responding to her," Nathan observed, amazed. "They don't seem scared of Emma at all." Indeed, the injured cub had taken a hesitant step toward the playpen, nose twitching as it caught Emma's scent. The baby responded with delighted giggles, completely unafraid of the wild creatures now approaching her. "Nathan," Olivia warned, tensing to rush forward if needed, but her husband placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Wait," he whispered. "Just watch." The uninjured cub joined its sibling, and together they approached Emma's playpen with cautious curiosity. The baby reached her hand through the bars, her tiny fingers outstretched toward the bears in a gesture of innocent welcome that brought tears to Olivia's eyes. "She's not afraid," she whispered. "Look at her." For what seemed like an eternity, the human child and the bear cubs regarded each other across the divide of species and experience. Then, with infinite gentleness, the injured cub extended its nose and lightly touched Emma's fingertips. The simple contact, tender and trusting, broke something open in the room. A door between worlds that adults rarely glimpsed, but that children seemed to navigate with ease. Emma laughed, a sound of pure joy that made both cubs startle, then relax, their eyes brightening with what looked remarkably like hope. In that extraordinary moment, as snow fell silently beyond the windows and the fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, the Bennett family's understanding of compassion and connection began to transform in ways they could never have anticipated. And the night was still young, with many more surprises yet to unfold beneath their cabin roof. As the initial shock faded, the practical concerns of caring for their unexpected guests took precedence. The cubs, having made their tentative introduction to Emma, retreated to a corner near the fireplace, their wild instincts drawing them to the warmth while maintaining a safe distance from the humans. "They need water," Olivia said, moving slowly toward the kitchen. "And probably food. What do bear cubs even eat?" Nathan, who had grown up in a rural area, considered the question. "Berries, nuts, fish, but they'll probably eat whatever we offer at this point. They look half-starved." While Olivia carefully filled a shallow bowl with water, Nathan rummaged through their pantry, eventually producing some unsalted nuts, sliced apples, and a bit of leftover grilled chicken from dinner. He arranged these offerings on a plate, then slowly approached the cubs, setting both food and water within their reach before backing away. The injured cub sniffed cautiously at the offerings, then began to lap desperately at the water. Its companion sampled the chicken first, then the fruit, eating with a controlled urgency that spoke volumes about their recent deprivation. The humans watched in fascinated silence, hardly believing they were witnessing such a scene in their own living room. Emma, still enthralled by their visitors, had grown increasingly restless in her playpen. She babbled insistently, reaching her arms toward the bears with clear intention. "She wants to get closer to them," Nathan observed, his voice tinged with both wonder and concern. Olivia bit her lip. "I don't know if that's safe, even if they seem gentle." As if sensing the adult's hesitation, the healthier cub looked up from its meal and made direct eye contact with Olivia. There was something in that gaze, something impossibly knowing and ancient, that made her breath catch. This wasn't just a wild animal driven by instinct. There was intelligence there, and a silent communication that transcended language. "Nathan," she whispered, "do you feel that? It's like they're, I don't know, asking for our trust." Before he could answer, Emma let out a frustrated cry, straining against the confines of her playpen with surprising determination for one so small. Her blue eyes, filled with tears, moved from the cubs to her parents with an expression that needed no interpretation. She wanted to be part of whatever was happening. The parents exchanged a long look, having one of those silent conversations that only couples who truly understand each other can have. Finally, Nathan nodded. "We'll be right here," he assured his wife. "Every second." With careful movements, Olivia lifted Emma from the playpen and sat cross-legged on the floor, the baby secure in her lap but still at a safe distance from the cubs. Nathan joined them, forming a protective half-circle around their daughter. The bears had finished their meal and were watching this new development with alert eyes. The injured one winced as it shifted position, drawing Emma's attention immediately. The baby pointed at the hurt paw, her face scrunching in what looked remarkably like concern. "Ow," she said clearly, one of the few recognizable words in her limited vocabulary. "Ow." "Yes, sweetheart," Olivia confirmed softly. "The bear has an OE." What happened next would remain etched in the Bennetts' memory forever. Emma squirmed in her mother's lap until she was allowed to slide onto the floor. Before either parent could react, she crawled directly toward the injured cub, moving with the innocent confidence of a child who hasn't yet learned to fear the unknown. "Emma," Nathan called, reaching to pull her back, but he paused as the cub's reaction registered. Instead of showing aggression or fear, they watched her approach with what could only be described as gentle curiosity. The injured one lowered its head to Emma's level, their faces coming to rest mere inches apart. For a breathless moment, time itself seemed suspended. Then, with a tenderness that defied explanation, Emma reached out and very gently patted the cub's hurt paw, just as her parents did when she fell and hurt herself. "Ow," she repeated softly. "Ow, gone." The cub held perfectly still, allowing this strange hairless creature to touch its most vulnerable spot without protest. Its companion moved closer, forming a protective circle that now included the human child. Emma looked up at her parents with a beaming smile, completely at ease in the presence of wild nature that most adults would flee from in terror. Tears filled Olivia's eyes as she witnessed this impossible moment of connection. "She's comforting it," she whispered to Nathan, whose own eyes had grown suspiciously bright. "And it's letting her," he replied, voice thick with emotion. Outside, the snow fell more heavily, blanketing the forest in pristine white. Inside, a different kind of purity was unfolding, the innocent compassion of a child who saw not danger, but only another being in pain, and the trusting response of creatures who recognized kindness across the boundaries of species. As Emma continued her gentle ministrations, the injured cub made a soft sound almost like a purr, closing its eyes in what seemed like relief. The other cub, watching closely, slowly lowered itself to the floor beside them, creating a picture of harmony that defied every natural law the adults thought they understood. In that moment, something profound and wordless passed between the beings in that room, a recognition that transcended the ordinary boundaries of human and wild, predator and prey, fear and trust. And for the Bennett family, nothing would ever be quite the same again. Night deepened outside the cabin windows, the snow continuing its silent descent upon the forest. Inside, an extraordinary scene of trust had unfolded, leaving Nathan and Olivia speechless with wonder. Their daughter, not even a year old, had bridged a gap they would have thought impossible. Emma had eventually tired herself out and now dozed peacefully on a blanket near the fireplace. Beside her, curled in a protective semicircle, the two bear cubs slept as well, their first peaceful rest in what must have been days. The injured cub's paw rested gently against Emma's tiny foot, a connection maintained even in sleep. "We should move her," Nathan whispered, though he made no immediate move to do so. The scene before them was so peaceful, so utterly magical, that disturbing it felt almost sacrilegious. Olivia leaned against his shoulder, her eyes never leaving the sleeping forms of their daughter and the wild orphans who had sought their help. "I keep thinking about their mother," she murmured. What could have happened to her? Nathan had been wondering the same thing. Bears were protective parents, fiercely devoted to their young. For these cubs to be alone, something tragic must have occurred. Hunters, maybe. he suggested grimly. Or an accident. The logging operation a few miles north has been pushing wildlife closer to residential areas. The thought hung heavy in the air between them. Human encroachment on wilderness had consequences that went far beyond inconvenience or property disputes. These young bears were living proof of the fragile balance between civilization and nature, a balance that too often tipped in humanity's favor at devastating cost. As if sensing their somber thoughts, the uninjured cub stirred in its sleep, making a soft whimpering sound that tugged at their hearts. Emma, responding instinctively even while asleep, placed her small hand on the cub's fur in a gesture of comfort. The bear immediately settled, its breathing returning to the deep rhythm of peaceful slumber. "How does she know?" Olivia whispered, amazed. "How does she understand exactly what they need?" Nathan shook his head, equally mystified. "Maybe children see things more clearly than we do, before they learn all our fears and prejudices." As they watched, Emma shifted slightly in her sleep, and something tumbled from her grasp. Her favorite comfort blanket, a small square of soft blue fabric that she refused to sleep without. It had been clutched in her hand when she approached the cubs earlier, and now it lay across the injured cub's hurt paw, as if intentionally placed there. The sight was too much for Olivia. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks as she pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. She gave them her blanket, she managed through her tears, her most precious thing. Nathan wrapped an arm around his wife, his own vision blurring. "Out of the mouths of babes," he quoted softly, or in this case, the actions of babes. Their daughter, barely old enough to stand, unable to form complete sentences, still learning the basics of human interaction, had demonstrated a level of empathy and compassion that shamed them both. While they had hesitated at the door, weighing risks and consequences, Emma had seen only suffering creatures in need of kindness. The lesson wasn't lost on either parent. In that moment, watching their child share her most beloved possession with orphaned wild creatures, they recognized how easily adults forgot the simple truths that children seem to understand instinctively, that pain deserved comfort, fear deserved reassurance, and loneliness deserved connection, regardless of species or circumstance. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling around the eaves of the cabin and rattling the windows. The contrast between the howling elements and the peaceful scene before them only heightened the sense of sanctuary they had created, however temporarily, for these lost cubs. "What will we do in the morning?" Olivia asked softly, the practical question unavoidable despite the magic of the moment. Nathan sighed, considering their options. "Call the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center in Riverton, I guess. They'll know how to care for them properly." The words were sensible, responsible, and yet they both felt a strange reluctance at the thought of ending this unprecedented communion. Something profound was happening in their home tonight, something that transcended ordinary experience and touched the deepest part of what it meant to share this planet with other living beings. As if reading their thoughts, the injured cub opened its eyes briefly, looking directly at the adult humans with an expression so knowing, so eerily intelligent, that both Nathan and Olivia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter night. In that gaze was something ancient and wise, something that seemed to see through their human pretenses to the animal hearts that beat beneath their civilized exteriors. Then the moment passed, the cub's eyes drifting closed again as it nestled closer to Emma, finding comfort in her innocent presence. The little girl sighed in her sleep, one arm draped protectively over her wild companion's, as naturally as if she'd been doing it all her life. Tomorrow would bring decisions and responsibilities, calls to authorities, and explanations. But tonight belonged to this improbable circle of trust. A child and 2 bear cubs, teaching the adults what true compassion looked like in its purest form. Morning light filtered through the frost-covered windows, casting a golden glow over the living room. Nathan awoke first, stiff from spending the night in an armchair, keeping watch over the extraordinary scene on the floor. For a moment, he wondered if the events of the previous night had been a particularly vivid dream. But no, there was Emma, still sleeping peacefully on her blanket, and beside her the 2 bear cubs, their dark fur contrasting sharply with the light-colored carpet. During the night, his daughter had somehow migrated from her original position and now lay curled between the bears, one tiny hand resting on the injured cub's back, the other flung across the second cub's neck. They formed a perfect circle of warmth and trust, rising and falling with each synchronized breath. Olivia stirred in the chair opposite, her eyes widening as she took in the scene. "They're still asleep," she whispered, a smile of wonder spreading across her face. "Like they've been lifelong friends," Nathan agreed, unable to tear his gaze away from the improbable trio. As if sensing their parents' attention, Emma's eyes fluttered open. She regarded the sleeping cubs beside her with absolute delight, patting them gently as she might a beloved pet. "Ba," she said happily. "My Ba." The cubs awakened at her touch, stretching and yawning in a manner so dog-like that Nathan and Olivia couldn't help but smile. The injured one tested its paw gingerly, and both parents noticed with surprise that the swelling seemed to have decreased overnight. Perhaps rest and warmth had been all it needed. "I should call the Wildlife Center," Nathan said reluctantly, reaching for his phone. But before he could dial, a movement outside the window caught his attention. "Liv," he whispered urgently. "Look." At the edge of the forest, barely visible through the veil of falling snow, stood a large adult bear. Its powerful form was unmistakable, even at a distance, and its attention was fixed unwaveringly on their cabin. "The mother," Olivia breathed, her heart racing. She found them. The cubs, alert now, suddenly raised their heads toward the window, their behavior instantly changing. Their ears perked forward, and they made soft, excited noises, unlike anything the humans had heard from them before. Emma, sensing the change, looked from the cubs to her parents with a questioning expression. "But go?" she asked, displaying an intuition that continued to astonish them. Nathan and Olivia exchanged a look loaded with conflicting emotions. If this was indeed the cub's mother, returned against all odds to reclaim her young, the right thing to do was clear, and yet the thought of sending these vulnerable creatures back into the harsh winter wilderness tore at their hearts. "Maybe she wasn't gone," Olivia suggested. "Maybe she was just unable to reach them for some reason. Separated by the storm, or—" Nathan nodded, wanting to believe this more optimistic scenario. The snow was heavy yesterday. They could have been cut off from each other. As they watched, the adult bear shifted position and they gasped in unison. The bear was favoring one side, moving with a noticeable limp that mirrored the injury of one of the cubs. Despite this handicap, she had somehow tracked her young to this human dwelling, driven by the powerful bond of maternal love. "She's hurt, too," Olivia whispered, her eyes filling with tears. She came for them despite being injured herself. The connection was clear now. The family had been separated, perhaps by accident or environmental conditions, and the mother's injury had prevented her from finding her cubs until now. The realization was both heartbreaking and hopeful. Emma, with that uncanny understanding that had marked this entire experience, crawled to her feet and toddled toward the window, pointing excitedly. "Mama Ba," she declared with absolute certainty. The cubs responded to her movement, following close behind as if they understood exactly what was happening. They pressed their noses to the glass, making soft whimpering sounds that needed no translation. They recognized their mother. The moment of decision had arrived. Nathan and Olivia knew what they had to do, however much it might pain them to end this magical interlude. "We need to help them reunite," Nathan said softly. "It's the right thing." Olivia nodded, wiping away tears. "I know. But Nathan, what if the mother's afraid of us? What if she thinks we've harmed her cubs?" It was a valid concern. Adult bears were notoriously protective and potentially dangerous, especially when it came to their young. The fact that this one was injured only added to the unpredictability of the situation. Yet something in the way the mother bear waited at the forest's edge, patient and watchful rather than aggressive, gave them hope that this reunion might unfold peacefully. Emma, as if understanding the adults' hesitation, turned to her parents with an expression of complete confidence. "Help Ba," she urged, her simple words carrying a wisdom beyond her years. Nathan took a deep breath and nodded. "We'll go together," he decided. "Slowly, carefully. We'll open the door and step back, let the cubs make their own way to her." Olivia gathered Emma into her arms, holding her securely as Nathan moved toward the door. The cubs followed his movement with their eyes, seeming to understand that the moment of departure had come. As he reached for the doorknob, the injured cub made a soft sound, not of distress, but almost like a farewell. With steady hands, Nathan opened the door to the porch, then stepped back beside his family. Cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and snow, but the cubs didn't immediately rush toward freedom. Instead, they turned back toward Emma, approaching her one last time. What happened next would be forever etched in the Bennett's memory. The cubs rose on their hind legs, bringing themselves to eye level with the baby in Olivia's arms. For a breathless moment, wild and human gazes locked in silent communion. Then, with gentle movements that defied their wild nature, each cub touched its nose to Emma's outstretched hand, a gesture of goodbye that brought fresh tears to both parents' eyes. "Bye-bye," Emma said softly, understanding perfectly what was happening. She showed no distress, only a solemn acceptance that reflected wisdom far beyond her months on Earth. The uninjured cub was the first to turn away, moving with purpose toward the open door. Its sibling followed more slowly, limping but determined, pausing at the threshold to look back one final time at the humans who had offered sanctuary when it was most needed. From the forest's edge, the mother bear watched with unwavering attention, her massive body tense but not threatening. When her cubs emerged from the human dwelling, she made a low, rumbling sound that carried clearly through the crisp morning air, a call of recognition and relief. The cubs responded immediately, their pace quickening as they made their way through the snow toward their mother. The reunion, when it came, was achingly beautiful. The adult bear nuzzling each cub thoroughly, checking them over with the universal concern of a parent separated from their young. Emma squirmed in Olivia's arms, pointing excitedly. "Happy Ba," she declared, her face alight with joy at the family's reunion. "Yes, sweetheart," Olivia whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "The bear family is together again." As they watched from the safety of their doorway, the mother bear raised her head and looked directly at the humans. In that gaze was something that transcended the natural boundaries between species, a recognition, an acknowledgement, perhaps even gratitude. For a long moment, wild and human eyes met across the divide of evolutionary paths that had separated their kinds eons ago. Then, with a grace that belied her injury, the mother bear turned and led her cubs back toward the depths of the forest, their dark forms gradually disappearing into the trees until only their tracks remained in the fresh snow. A temporary record of an extraordinary encounter that would soon be erased by the continuing winter storm. Nathan closed the door slowly, the cabin suddenly feeling emptier despite the return to normalcy. Emma reached toward the window, her expression wistful. "Bah, gone," she said softly. "Yes, sweetheart," Nathan replied, gathering his family into a tight embrace. "The bears have gone home with their mama, just like you're home with yours." Olivia pressed a kiss to their daughter's head, breathing in her familiar scent. "They needed help, and you showed us how to give it," she told the baby. "You saw with your heart, not your fear." As the day progressed and the extraordinary night faded into memory, the Bennett family moved through their routine with a newfound perspective. What they had witnessed, the pure compassion of their child, the trust of wild creatures in desperate need, the powerful bonds of family that transcended species, had transformed them in ways they were only beginning to understand. That evening, as Emma drifted to sleep in her crib, still occasionally murmuring "bah" in her dreams, Nathan and Olivia stood at their living room window, gazing out at the snow-covered forest that no longer seemed quite so alien or threatening. "Do you think we'll ever see them again?" Olivia asked softly. Nathan placed an arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think they've left their mark on us regardless." Indeed, something had shifted in their understanding of the world and their place in it. Through the innocent wisdom of their child and the trust of wild creatures in dire need, they had glimpsed a deeper truth: that compassion was not a uniquely human trait, that boundaries between species could dissolve in moments of genuine connection, and that sometimes the greatest teachers were those who had no words at all. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the tracks that led back to the forest. But the path that had been forged between worlds, between human and wild, between fear and trust, between separation and connection, would remain open in their hearts forever. And throughout the forest that night, as the Bennett family slept peacefully in their cabin, the soft grunts and murmurs of a reunited bear family echoed among the snow-laden pines. A reminder that in a world often divided by fear and misunderstanding, simple acts of compassion could bridge the greatest divides, bringing tears of gratitude to the eyes of all who were fortunate enough to witness them. 3 weeks passed, the winter deepening its hold on the forest. The Bennett family had shared their extraordinary story with only their closest friends, knowing that most would either disbelieve them or, worse, alert authorities who might misunderstand the situation. Some nights, Emma would stand at the window before bedtime, pointing out at the darkened trees and whispering "bah" with such longing that it made her parents' hearts ache. "Do you think she really remembers them?" Olivia asked one evening as they tucked their daughter into bed. "Or is it just a passing fascination?" Nathan stroked Emma's soft hair as she drifted to sleep. "I think some connections go deeper than memory," he said quietly, "especially the ones formed when we're most vulnerable." The following morning brought a fresh blanket of snow and an unexpected visitor. Nathan was clearing the driveway when he spotted unfamiliar tire tracks leading up to their cabin. Following them with his eyes, he saw a forest ranger's truck parked at the edge of their property. A woman in a green uniform approached, her expression serious beneath her wide-brimmed hat. "Mr. Bennett, I'm Ranger Morgan. Could I have a word with you and your wife?" Nathan's heart sank. Had someone reported their bear encounter after all? He led the ranger inside, where Olivia was feeding Emma breakfast. "Mrs. Bennett," the ranger nodded politely, then got straight to the point. We've been tracking an unusual situation in this area. A mother bear and 2 cubs have been exhibiting some very atypical behavior. Olivia nearly dropped the baby spoon she was holding. "What kind of behavior?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Ranger Morgan pulled out a small tablet and showed them a series of trail camera images. These were taken about half a mile from your property. The bears have been returning to this same spot every few days. She swiped to another image that made both parents gasp. There, clearly visible in the snowy clearing, were 3 bears, and a small pile of what appeared to be berries and nuts, arranged in an unnaturally deliberate pattern. "This isn't normal wildlife behavior," the ranger continued, studying their reactions closely. "It's almost as if they're leaving offerings." "Offerings to whom?" Nathan asked, though he already suspected the answer. "That's what I'm trying to figure out." The ranger's gaze sharpened. "The interesting thing is, these offerings appear in a clearing with a direct line of sight to your cabin." A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by Emma's cheerful babbling as she played with her breakfast. When she spotted the images on the ranger's tablet, however, she let out a squeal of delight. "Bah!" she exclaimed, pointing excitedly. "My bah?" Ranger Morgan's eyebrows shot up. "Would you like to tell me what's going on here, Mr. and Mrs. Bennett?" Nathan and Olivia exchanged a look. Then, with a deep breath, Nathan began to tell their story. He described the night the cubs had appeared on their doorstep, Emma's extraordinary connection with them, and the emotional reunion with their mother. As he spoke, the ranger's expression shifted from skepticism to wonder. "In all my 15 years working these forests, I've never heard anything like this," she admitted when he finished. "But it would explain the behavior we've been observing." She looked thoughtfully at Emma, who was still pointing at the images and repeating "bah" with obvious recognition. "There's more," Ranger Morgan continued. "The mother bear you described was likely the victim of a poaching attempt. We found evidence of an illegal trap about 3 miles east of here. She must have been caught in it, managed to free herself, but got separated from her cubs in the process." The news confirmed their suspicions, but brought fresh anger at the thought of someone deliberately harming these animals. "Will she recover?" Olivia asked. "Bears are resilient," the ranger assured them. "But this family unit seems to have formed a unique attachment to yours." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully, "particularly to your daughter." Emma, as if understanding she was the topic of conversation, looked up with bright eyes. "Siba?" she asked hopefully. The adults exchanged uncertain glances. "That wouldn't be advisable," Ranger Morgan said firmly. "Despite this unusual situation, they're still wild animals. The mother is protective and potentially dangerous." Nathan nodded in agreement, but a nagging feeling persisted, a sense that there was more to this story than mere coincidence. "What will happen to them now?" he asked. "We'll continue to monitor them," the ranger replied. "Winter is a challenging time for bears, especially those with cubs. Normally, they would be in deeper hibernation by now, but this family seems to be maintaining unusual activity levels." She packed away her tablet. "I'd like to set up a trail camera closer to your property, with your permission. This could be valuable research for understanding bear cognition and behavior." After the ranger left, Nathan and Olivia sat in thoughtful silence, processing this new development. Their encounter, it seemed, had affected the bears as profoundly as it had affected them. "Offerings," Olivia murmured, still amazed by the concept. "They're trying to communicate with us, aren't they?" Nathan nodded slowly. "Or thank us. Or—" he hesitated. "Or perhaps they're trying to maintain the connection with Emma." Their daughter had fallen asleep for her morning nap, her small face peaceful. They wondered what she dreamed about, if perhaps in her innocent slumber she still communed with the creatures who had shared that magical night with her. Later that afternoon, as dusk approached, Nathan stood at the kitchen window washing dishes when he froze, the plate in his hand forgotten. At the forest's edge, partially obscured by falling snow and the gathering darkness, stood a familiar silhouette, the mother bear, watching the cabin with unwavering attention. "Liv?" he called softly. "She's back." Olivia joined him at the window, Emma on her hip. The moment the baby spotted the bear, she became animated, reaching toward the window with such yearning that it was almost painful to witness. "We can't, Emma," Olivia whispered, holding her daughter securely. "It's not safe." But the bear didn't approach. She simply stood at the boundary between forest and clearing, as if acknowledging an invisible line that separated their worlds. After several minutes, she melted back into the trees, leaving only her massive paw prints in the fresh snow. That night, the wind picked up, howling around the eaves of the cabin with unusual ferocity. By morning, a full blizzard had descended upon the region, the worst in recent memory according to the emergency broadcasts. The Bennetts found themselves completely snowbound, the drifts piling higher than their windows. "The generator should hold," Nathan assured Olivia as they huddled near the fireplace. "We've got enough firewood and supplies for at least a week." Emma seemed untroubled by the storm, contentedly playing with her toys on the living room floor. Occasionally, she would tilt her head as if listening to a sound only she could hear beneath the howling wind. The day passed slowly, the family finding comfort in each other's company as the storm raged outside. As night fell again, they prepared for bed early, the constant roar of the blizzard having drained them both. It was just past midnight when they were jolted awake by a tremendous crash, followed by the unmistakable sound of breaking glass. Nathan leapt from bed, heart pounding. "Stay with Emma," he told Olivia as he grabbed the baseball bat they kept for home defense. Cautiously, he made his way down the dark hallway toward the source of the noise. The temperature dropped noticeably as he approached the living room, where he discovered the cause. A massive pine branch had smashed through one of the windows, allowing snow and freezing wind to pour into their home. "Natan," Olivia called from behind him, having followed despite his warning. Emma was clutched in her arms, surprisingly calm despite the chaos. "What happened?" "Tree branch," he explained, already moving to assess the damage. "The storm must have brought it down. We need to cover this before the whole house freezes." Working together, they managed to secure a piece of plywood over the broken window, but not before a significant amount of snow had accumulated on the living room floor. The temperature had plummeted, and despite the roaring fire they rekindled, a bone-deep chill permeated the cabin. "The bedrooms are too cold," Olivia decided, gathering blankets. "We'll have to sleep out here by the fire tonight." They created a makeshift bed of cushions and blankets, placing Emma between them for warmth. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating, its fury seeming almost personal in its intensity. Just as they were settling in, Emma suddenly sat upright, pointing toward the damaged window with absolute conviction. "Ba, come," she declared, her voice carrying clearly above the howling wind. Nathan and Olivia exchanged worried glances. "It's just the storm, sweetheart," Olivia soothed, trying to coax her daughter back under the warm blankets. But Emma was insistent, becoming increasingly agitated. "Ba hurt," she cried, genuine distress in her voice. "Ba cold." Nathan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the broken window. Emma had displayed an uncanny connection with the bears before. Was it possible she was sensing something now? It could be a dream, Olivia suggested uncertainly, but her eyes reflected the same question forming in Nathan's mind. Before they could discuss it further, a new sound rose above the wind. A low, mournful cry that was definitely not the storm. It came again, closer this time, followed by a scratching at the front door that made the hairs on Nathan's neck stand on end. Emma wriggled free of her mother's arms, toddling toward the door with determination. "Bah!" she called out, distress giving way to certainty. The scratching came again, more insistent now, accompanied by whimpering that sounded eerily familiar. With trembling hands, Nathan approached the door, Olivia close behind with Emma in her arms. "Nathan, be careful," she whispered, her voice tight with fear and anticipation. He nodded, then slowly, heart pounding, opened the door a crack. The sight that greeted them stole the breath from his lungs. There, on their porch, covered in snow and trembling violently, were the two bear cubs, but this time they weren't alone. Sprawled beside them, barely moving, was their mother, her massive form half buried in snowdrifts. Blood stained the snow beneath her, steaming slightly in the frigid air. "Oh my God!" Olivia gasped. "She's hurt. Badly." The cubs, recognizing the humans, made pitiful sounds of distress, nudging at their mother's still form. The message couldn't have been clearer if they'd spoken aloud. They had brought their injured mother to the only place they knew might offer help. "Nathan, we can't just leave them out there to die," Olivia said, her voice breaking. "And we can't bring a full-grown bear into our house," he countered, though his resolve was already weakening. "It would be insane." Emma, watching the scene unfold with those wise eyes that seemed to understand far more than she should, reached out toward the injured bear. "Help Mama Ba," she pleaded, her small face crumpling with empathy. In that moment, looking from his daughter's tear-filled eyes to the desperate cubs and their fallen mother, Nathan knew they had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. This wasn't about one night of shelter anymore. This wasn't even about the extraordinary bond between Emma and the cubs. This was about a fundamental choice, to acknowledge the connection between all living things and act with compassion, or to turn away in fear. "We need to call someone," he said, reaching for his phone. "The ranger, there's no signal," Olivia reminded him, gesturing at the phone's empty bars. The storm knocked out the towers, and even if we could reach her, no one could get through these roads now. The reality of their situation settled over them like the heavy snow outside. They were completely on their own, with a critically injured wild animal at their doorstep and two desperate cubs depending on them. Emma continued to strain toward the bears, her instincts unclouded by adult fears and hesitations. "Please," she said clearly, a new word in her vocabulary, but used with perfect understanding of its power. Nathan looked at his wife, saw the same determination reflected in her eyes that he felt growing in his own heart. With a nod of silent agreement, they made their decision. "We'll need the sled from the shed," he said, already planning. "And all the blankets we can spare. If we can get her onto the sled, maybe we can pull her into the mudroom at least." Olivia nodded, already moving to gather supplies. "I'll get the first aid kit, and there's a bottle of veterinary antiseptic in the medicine cabinet from when we had the dog." As they sprang into action, the cubs watched with what seemed like hope in their dark eyes. They moved aside when Nathan approached their mother, allowing him to assess her injuries. A deep gash ran along her flank, likely from another encounter with human-made dangers, perhaps barbed wire, or the sharp edge of abandoned machinery. Getting the massive bear onto the sled was a Herculean task that left both adults gasping and sweating despite the freezing temperature. The cubs followed anxiously as they pulled their precious cargo toward the house, occasionally making soft sounds of encouragement to their mother, who responded with weak grunts. The mudroom's too small, Nathan realized as they approached the house. We'll have to bring her all the way into the living room. Olivia nodded, beyond questioning the sanity of their actions now. The fire will help keep her warm. Together, they managed to maneuver the sled through the door and into the main living area, where the fire cast flickering orange light over the extraordinary scene. A fully grown wild bear being tended by humans in their own home, while her cubs hovered anxiously nearby, and a human baby watched with solemn understanding. As Nathan carefully cut away the fur around the wound, Olivia prepared antiseptic and bandages with steady hands that belied the strangeness of the situation. Emma sat nearby, occasionally speaking soft words of reassurance to the cubs in her limited vocabulary. "But good," she would say whenever they grew restless. "Mama, ba good." The night wore on, the storm's fury unabated outside while inside. An impossible vigil took place. The mother bear drifted in and out of consciousness, her breathing labored but persistent. The cubs refused to leave her side, though they accepted the water and food Olivia offered with touching gratitude. By dawn, the worst seemed to have passed. The bear's breathing had steadied, and the bleeding had stopped. Nathan and Olivia, exhausted beyond measure, sat together on the couch, watching as Emma dozed between the two cubs, all three nestled against the massive form of the mother bear. "What have we done, Nathan?" Olivia whispered, the full weight of their actions finally sinking in. He shook his head, unable to find words for the line they had crossed. "I don't know, but I don't think we had a choice. No one will believe this," she said, gesturing at the scene before them. Wild and domestic, predator and prey, united in a tableau that defied everything they had been taught about the natural order. "I'm not sure I believe it myself," he admitted. "But Emma—" He trailed off, watching their daughter sleep peacefully in the presence of creatures that should, by all conventional wisdom, pose a deadly threat to her. "She never doubted," Olivia finished for him, "not for a second." As the new day dawned, the storm finally began to abate, sunlight occasionally breaking through the clouds. The mother bear stirred, raising her massive head to check on her cubs. Finding them safe, she then turned her gaze to the humans who had once again provided sanctuary in their hour of need. In her dark eyes was a depth of understanding that transcended language or species, a recognition of the extraordinary bond that had formed between their families, and the debt that could never truly be repaid in full. Yet, as the days passed and the bear's strength gradually returned, the Bennetts would discover that some debts are honored in ways that reshape one's understanding of the world and one's place within it, and that the true gift of compassion lies not in the giving, but in how it transforms those who dare to offer it when fear would counsel caution. The next 3 days passed in a surreal blur for the Bennett family. The blizzard had cut them off completely from the outside world. No electricity except what their generator provided, no phone service, and roads buried under feet of snow. In this isolated bubble, they found themselves living in unprecedented harmony with their wild guests. The mother bear, whom they had started calling Luna after the crescent-shaped patch of lighter fur on her chest, grew stronger each day. Nathan changed her bandages twice daily, approaching the task with a caution that gradually gave way to a tentative trust. Luna would watch him with intelligent eyes, remaining perfectly still during these treatments as if she understood his intentions. The cubs, now nicknamed Shadow and Pebble for their distinctive personalities, had completely shed their initial wariness. They played gentle games with Emma on the living room floor, under the watchful eyes of both mothers, human and bear. Olivia found herself marveling at Luna's parenting, recognizing patterns of guidance, discipline, and affection that mirrored her own approaches with Emma. "It's like watching another version of motherhood," she confided to Nathan one evening as they observed Luna gently correcting Pebble when his play with Emma grew too rough. Different form, same essence. By the fourth day, the skies had cleared and the temperature had risen enough to begin melting the massive snowdrifts. Nathan managed to get a weak cell signal by standing on the roof, where he found multiple missed calls from Ranger Morgan. "The service is terrible," he told her when he finally connected. "We're fine, just snowed in. The generator's holding up." "Thank goodness," she replied, the relief evident in her voice. "We've been trying to reach you for days. The storm hit your area hardest. Search and rescue is still clearing the main roads." Nathan hesitated, torn between truth and caution. "Any news on those bears you were tracking?" he asked carefully. "That's actually one reason I was calling," the ranger said, her tone shifting to concern. "They've disappeared from our trail cameras. With the mother's injury and this unprecedented storm, I hate to say it, but the outlook isn't good. Bears are resilient, but nature can be unforgiving." Nathan swallowed hard, looking through the skylight where he could see Emma sitting beside Luna, reading a picture book to the attentive bear and her cubs. "Yeah," he said vaguely, "nature's full of surprises." After ending the call, he climbed down to find Olivia waiting with anxious eyes. "Roads should be clear within a day or two," he reported, "but we have a decision to make." That evening, after Emma had fallen asleep, the adults sat at the kitchen table, speaking in hushed tones while their improbable house guests rested by the fire. "We can't keep this secret forever," Nathan argued. "Luna is a wild animal, and eventually she'll be strong enough to leave." "But what if someone finds out we've been harboring them?" Olivia countered. "We could be fined, maybe even arrested for endangering Emma." Their whispered debate was interrupted by a soft shuffling sound. Looking up, they were startled to find Luna standing in the kitchen doorway, her massive frame filling the space. Their breath caught, primal fear momentarily overriding the tentative trust they'd established. Luna made no threatening moves. She simply regarded them with those knowing eyes, then deliberately turned and padded back to the living room. Curious, they followed, watching as she gently nosed her sleeping cubs and then moved to the front door, where she looked back at the humans expectantly. "I think she wants to leave," Olivia whispered, a complex mixture of relief and sadness washing over her. Nathan nodded, approaching the door cautiously. Luna stepped back, giving him space to open it. The night air was crisp and clear, the storm having passed completely, leaving a transformed landscape of sparkling snow under a canopy of brilliant stars. Luna limped onto the porch, her wound still healing but no longer debilitating. The adults held their breath, waiting to see if she would disappear into the night with her cubs. Instead, she made a soft huffing sound, then descended the porch steps and circled the cabin slowly, methodically, as if patrolling the perimeter. "What is she doing?" Olivia wondered. Nathan watched in fascination. "I think she's checking the territory, making sure it's safe." After completing her circuit, Luna returned to the porch and fixed them with a steady gaze before re-entering the cabin and settling once again beside her cubs and the sleeping Emma. The message seemed clear. Not yet. She wasn't ready to leave, and neither were her young. The next morning brought another surprise. Nathan, stepping outside to check the generator, noticed unusual tracks in the snow. Multiple sets of larger bear prints forming a wide circle around their property. As he followed them with growing amazement, he realized what they meant. There are other bears out there, he told Olivia when he returned inside. At least 3, maybe 4 adults. They've been circling the cabin but keeping their distance. Luna's family group? Olivia suggested, glancing nervously toward the window. Maybe, Nathan agreed. Black bears sometimes form loose social connections, especially among related females. Emma, catching the tension in their voices, toddled over to the window and pressed her small hands against the glass. "Morba," she said with simple acceptance, as if the presence of additional bears was the most natural thing in the world. The day passed uneventfully, but that night they were awakened by a chorus of low grunts and huffs outside the cabin. Luna, who had been sleeping near the fireplace, raised her head alertly, but showed no signs of distress. "They're communicating," Nathan whispered in awe. "Her family is keeping vigil while she recovers." On the morning of the 7th day, they woke to the distant sound of engines. The road crews had finally reached their remote area. Normality, with all its complications, would soon return. Ranger Morgan was among the first to arrive, her truck plowing through the last of the snow-covered road to their driveway. Nathan met her outside, having convinced Luna and the cubs to remain in the back bedroom temporarily. "You folks really weathered the storm," the ranger greeted him. "When we couldn't reach you for so long, we feared the worst." "We were lucky," Nathan replied carefully. "Lost a window to a fallen branch, but otherwise just fine." The ranger seemed about to leave when she noticed something. Paw prints, clearly visible in the melting snow around the porch. Her expression shifted to professional alertness. "Mr. Bennett, you've had bears on your property, recently." Nathan felt a cold sweat break out despite the winter chill. "We've seen them at a distance," he admitted, hoping to deflect further questioning. But Ranger Morgan was already kneeling, examining the tracks with expert eyes. "These are fresh, multiple bears." She looked up at him sharply. "Including cubs, from the size of these prints." Before Nathan could formulate a response, the most extraordinary sound interrupted them. A perfect blend of baby laughter and cub vocalizations, emanating clearly from inside the house. The ranger's eyes widened. "Mr. Bennett, what exactly is going on here?" At that moment, the cabin door creaked open behind him, and Nathan turned to see Emma toddling onto the porch, followed closely by Shadow and Pebble. Behind them, filling the doorway with her imposing presence, stood Luna. Ranger Morgan froze, her hand instinctively moving toward the tranquilizer gun on her belt. "Don't move," she whispered urgently. "Stay completely still." But Emma, oblivious to the danger perceived by the adults, simply giggled and patted the cubs affectionately. "My ba," she declared, looking up at the ranger with innocent pride. What followed was a conversation unlike any Nathan could have imagined, conducted in the surreal setting of their living room with 3 wild bears as silent participants. Olivia provided hot coffee while the ranger listened, expression cycling between disbelief, amazement, and professional concern as they recounted the full, unvarnished story. "This is unprecedented," Ranger Morgan said finally, watching as Emma and the cubs dozed together on the floor. "In my entire career, I've never heard of anything remotely like this. It goes against everything we understand about wild bear behavior." "We know how it sounds," Olivia said. "If we hadn't lived it, we wouldn't believe it either." The ranger sighed, rubbing her temples. "The protocol here is clear. I should tranquilize them and relocate the entire family unit to a wilderness area far from human habitation." Nathan and Olivia exchanged pained glances. As much as they knew this extraordinary situation couldn't last forever, the thought of Luna and her cubs being forcibly removed brought unexpected grief. But Ranger Morgan continued, surprising them. What's happening here could be incredibly valuable from a research perspective. The bond they've formed with your daughter, their seeking help when injured, the extended family group behavior. This could change our understanding of bear cognition and social structures. Hope flickered in Olivia's eyes. What are you suggesting? A compromise, the ranger said slowly. With your permission, I'd like to bring in a wildlife biologist colleague, someone I trust completely. We could document this situation, study it under controlled conditions, before making any decisions about relocation. As they discussed the details, Luna watched from her corner, her intelligent eyes moving from speaker to speaker as if following the conversation. When Emma and the cubs awoke and resumed their gentle play, the ranger observed with undisguised wonder. Your daughter has no fear, she noted, and they respond to her with extraordinary gentleness. She saw them simply as beings who needed help, Nathan explained, without all our adult preconceptions about danger and separation. As the discussion continued, a new sound gradually registered, a deep, rumbling chorus from the forest edge. Looking out the window, they saw what had only been tracks before. 3 adult bears standing at the tree line, watching the cabin with focused attention. The extended family group, Ranger Morgan breathed, reaching for her camera. They're maintaining contact even across this distance. This challenges everything we thought we knew about black bear social structures. As days turned to weeks, the Bennett cabin became an unprecedented site of interspecies coexistence and scientific observation. Dr. Eliza Collins, the wildlife biologist brought in by Ranger Morgan, established careful protocols for documenting the unique bond between Emma and the bears, as well as the extraordinary behavior of Luna and her extended family group. What we're witnessing here is revolutionary, she explained to Nathan and Olivia one evening as they reviewed video footage of Emma teaching the cubs to stack wooden blocks. Bears have always been considered intelligent, but this level of trust, cooperation, and apparent understanding across species boundaries is simply unheard of. Luna's wound had healed completely, leaving only a silver scar beneath her fur. She had begun making short forays into the surrounding forest, sometimes with her cubs, sometimes alone, but always returning to the cabin where an extraordinary trust had been established. The adult bears at the forest edge maintained their vigilant presence, neither approaching the cabin nor retreating fully into the wilderness. Through careful observation, Dr. Collins had identified them as 2 females and 1 male, likely related to Luna. They're maintaining a protective perimeter, she explained. Not just around Luna and the cubs, but around your entire family. They've expanded their concept of social group to include you. As spring approached, bringing the first green shoots pushing through melting snow, the inevitable question could no longer be avoided. What would happen when the bears' natural instincts called them back to their wild existence? The answer came gradually, in a transition as organic as the changing seasons. Luna began spending more nights in the forest with her extended family, though she and the cubs would return every few days to visit. Emma seemed to understand this natural evolution, showing no distress when her Ba friends left, and pure joy when they returned. One particularly beautiful morning in late April, the Bennett family awoke to find Luna and her cubs waiting on the porch with unusual restlessness. Emma, now speaking in simple sentences, looked up at her parents with wise eyes that still sometimes seemed older than her years. "Ba, go home now," she said simply, reaching for the door. Outside, the spring air was fresh with possibility. Luna regarded them solemnly, her cubs now noticeably larger and more confident than the desperate, shivering creatures who had first appeared on their doorstep months ago. With gentle movements, Luna guided her cubs toward the forest edge, where the other adult bears waited. At the boundary, she paused, looking back at the human family, particularly at Emma, who stood between her parents, small face solemn but untroubled. In that gaze was a connection that transcended the limitations of different species and different worlds, a recognition of shared vulnerability, shared capacity for compassion, and shared understanding of maternal love. No words were necessary as Luna turned and led her family into the depths of the forest, disappearing among the trees that were their true home. Emma waved, a small hand raised in farewell to creatures who had transformed her young life in ways she might never fully articulate, but would carry with her always. "Will we see them again?" Olivia asked softly, tears streaming unchecked down her face. Nathan wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "I think we will, in one way or another." His words proved prophetic. Though Luna and her cubs eventually resumed a fully wild existence, they never completely severed the connection with the humans who had offered sanctuary in their darkest hour. Occasionally, throughout that year, and the years that followed, the Bennetts would wake to find small offerings on their porch. A perfectly formed honeycomb, a cluster of brightest berries, a particularly beautiful stone. Once, during a powerful summer thunderstorm, they glimpsed dark shapes patrolling the perimeter of their property, standing guard as they had during the winter crisis. The scientific papers published by Dr. Collins revolutionized understanding of bear cognition and behavior, though she carefully omitted specific location details to protect both the bears and the Bennett family from unwanted attention. Ranger Morgan established new protocols for human-wildlife conflict resolution based on the lessons learned from this extraordinary case. As for Emma, she grew from toddler to child with an uncanny affinity for all wild creatures and an instinctive understanding of their needs and behaviors. On her 5th birthday, while her friends from kindergarten played traditional games in the yard, she suddenly grew quiet, her attention drawn to the forest edge. There, partially concealed by the underbrush but unmistakable to those who knew what to look for, stood a large female bear with a silver scar along her flank. Beside her, no longer cubs, but not quite adults, were 2 younger bears watching the human celebration with curious eyes. Emma smiled and raised her hand in a small wave. The gesture was returned by a slight movement of the large bear's head before the family melted back into the protection of the trees. "Was that?" Olivia began, having witnessed the brief exchange. Emma nodded, her expression reflecting wisdom beyond her years. "Luna came to say happy birthday," she said simply, before rejoining her human friends. That night, after the party guests had gone and Emma had fallen asleep surrounded by new toys, Nathan and Olivia stood on their porch gazing at the star-filled sky above the forest. "Do you ever wonder how different our lives would have been if we hadn't opened the door that night?" Olivia asked softly. Nathan considered the question, thinking of all that had unfolded from that single moment of decision, the fear they had overcome, the connection they had witnessed, the boundaries they had crossed, and the understanding they had gained. "We would have missed the most important lesson of our lives," he replied finally. "That compassion isn't just a human virtue to be dispensed from above. It's the thread that connects all living things, if we have the courage to follow where it leads." Somewhere in the forest, under the same stars, Luna and her family settled into their wild existence, carrying with them memories of warmth and safety freely given when they needed it most. And in a small bedroom in the cabin, Emma dreamed of dark eyes and gentle paws, of boundaries crossed and worlds connected, of the extraordinary winter when 2 desperate bear cubs had begged to be let in, and a human baby's simple act of compassion had brought everyone to tears. The connection forged between them would remain, undiminished by time or distance, a testament to the truth that children know instinctively and adults sometimes forget. That the heart recognizes no species, acknowledges no boundaries, when the call for help is genuine and the response is pure. And in a world often divided by fear and misunderstanding, such moments of connection, however brief, however unlikely, remain our greatest hope for finding our way back to the harmony that once existed between all living things, and might one day exist again, if we have the wisdom to learn from those who see with their hearts rather than their fears. 5 years later, as autumn painted the forest in brilliant hues of red and gold, the Bennett family prepared for a bittersweet transition. Nathan had accepted a position at a university in another state, requiring them to leave the cabin that had been the site of so many extraordinary experiences. 10-year-old Emma, now a thoughtful child with an uncanny affinity for wildlife, took the news harder than they had anticipated. Though they had explained the exciting opportunities awaiting them, a new home near a nature preserve, excellent schools, closer proximity to grandparents, she remained uncharacteristically withdrawn as moving day approached. "It's not just the cabin," she confided to her parents the night before the moving trucks were scheduled to arrive. "It's Luna and her family. What if they come back and we're not here? What if they think we abandoned them?" Nathan and Olivia exchanged concerned glances. Though the bears had gradually returned to a fully wild existence, their occasional appearances at the forest's edge had continued throughout the years, silent, dignified acknowledgments of the bond that had formed during that extraordinary winter. The offerings still appeared periodically on their porch: seasonal berries, interesting pine cones, once even a perfect feather from a rare bird, tokens that defied conventional understanding of wildlife behavior. "Luna is very smart," Nathan reassured his daughter, sitting beside her on the porch swing that overlooked the forest. "She'll understand that this is part of human life, just as migration is part of the lives of many animals." Emma wasn't convinced. "But we're the only humans they trust," she insisted, her eyes filling with tears. "What if new people move in who don't understand? What if they're afraid and try to hurt them?" It was a valid concern. While Dr. Collins's research had dramatically influenced wildlife management policies in the region, creating broader protected zones and more nuanced approaches to human-wildlife conflict, not everyone shared their enlightened perspective. "I've been thinking about that too," Olivia admitted, joining them on the swing. "That's why I spoke with Ranger Morgan yesterday about leaving a detailed letter for the new owners, explaining the special situation here." Emma looked up hopefully. "Will they believe it?" "They might not at first," Nathan acknowledged, "but Luna and her family are pretty convincing when they want to be." That night, Emma slept fitfully, her dreams filled with dark eyes and gentle paws, and the memory of tiny cubs shivering on their doorstep. When dawn broke on moving day, she rose earlier than usual and slipped outside while her parents were occupied with the movers, making her way to the forest edge. Standing at the boundary between the manicured yard and the wild tangle of trees, she closed her eyes and concentrated in the way she'd discovered worked best over the years. Not calling exactly, but projecting her feelings outward. A wordless communication that somehow, impossibly, seemed to bridge the gap between species. "Emma," her mother's voice called from the cabin. "Where are you, sweetheart? The movers need to know which boxes go in your room." With a last, longing look at the silent forest, Emma turned back toward the house. "Coming, Mom." The morning passed in a whirlwind of activity. Boxes loaded, furniture wrapped, last-minute items packed away. By noon, almost everything had been transferred to the moving trucks, leaving the cabin strangely echoing and bare. Emma stood in what had been her bedroom, running her hand over the notches in the doorframe that had marked her growth over the years. "Emma," her father called. "Final walkthrough in 5 minutes, then we need to hit the road." With a heavy heart, she made her way downstairs, pausing at the living room window for one more look at the forest. What she saw made her gasp aloud. At the precise spot where the yard met the wilderness stood Luna. Older now, her muzzle showing signs of gray, but unmistakable with the silver scar along her flank. Beside her were her grown cubs, now impressive adults themselves, and behind them, partially obscured by the underbrush, several newer, younger bears, the next generation, evidence of Luna's successful matriarchy. "Mom! Dad!" Emma cried, her voice cracking with emotion. "They're here. They came to say goodbye." Nathan and Olivia rushed to the window, their own expressions softening at the sight of the bear family standing sentinel at the forest's edge. "How did they know?" Olivia whispered, awed despite the years of extraordinary interactions. Emma didn't answer. Some connections she had learned defied explanation. They simply were. Before her parents could stop her, she darted out the front door and across the yard, stopping at a respectful distance from the assembled bears. Luna watched her approach with those knowing eyes that had never lost their uncanny intelligence. "We have to go away," Emma said clearly, addressing the matriarch directly. "But I'll never forget you. Never." For a long moment, human and bear regarded each other across the divide of species and experience. Then, with deliberate movements that sent chills down the spines of the watching parents, Luna rose briefly on her hind legs, a posture usually associated with aggression in bears, but here transformed into something else entirely, a gesture of acknowledgement, a farewell. Emma raised her own hand in response, tears streaming freely down her face now. "Goodbye, Luna," she whispered. "Take care of your family." As if understanding perfectly, Luna dropped back to all fours and made a soft huffing sound to her assembled family. One by one, they melted back into the forest, Luna herself the last to go. At the edge of the trees, she paused for one final look at the human child who had once offered comfort to her desperate cubs, then disappeared into the dappled shadows. Nathan and Olivia reached Emma just as Luna vanished from sight. The three stood together, arms around each other, bearing witness to the end of an extraordinary chapter in their lives. "Do you think we'll ever see them again?" Emma asked, her voice small with grief. "I don't know, sweetheart," Nathan answered honestly. "But what you shared with them, what we all shared, that doesn't end just because we move away." As they returned to the cabin for the final preparations, Emma noticed something on the porch that hadn't been there earlier, a small, perfect pine cone, surrounded by an arrangement of late summer berries and a single downy feather. "A goodbye gift," Olivia said softly, watching as Emma carefully gathered the offering into her hands. The drive to their new home took 2 days, crossing mountain ranges and state lines, putting physical distance between them and the cabin that had been the site of such wonders. Emma was quieter than usual, gazing out the window at passing landscapes, the pine cone and feather carefully wrapped in a handkerchief in her pocket. Their new house was everything they had hoped for, spacious, modern, with a backyard that bordered a protected nature preserve. Yet, as they settled in over the following weeks, Emma continued to seem withdrawn, spending hours sitting on the back porch, watching the unfamiliar woods beyond their property. School began, bringing new friends and activities that gradually drew her out of her melancholy. Her teachers noted her extraordinary knowledge of wildlife behavior and ecology, encouraging her budding interest in biological sciences. Life moved forward, as it inevitably does, the extraordinary experiences at the cabin gradually becoming treasured memories rather than fresh wounds. And then, on a crisp October morning 3 months after their move, Emma came downstairs for breakfast and stopped dead in her tracks, staring at the back door with wide eyes. "Emma, what's wrong?" Olivia asked, concerned by her daughter's sudden pallor. Without answering, Emma moved to the door and opened it, stepping onto the back porch. There, arranged neatly on the welcome mat, was a small pile of unfamiliar berries surrounding a perfectly smooth river stone. "It's not possible," Nathan said when he saw it, his scientific mind rebelling against the implications. "We're 500 miles away. It can't be them." But Emma's radiant smile suggested otherwise. "Not them," she agreed. "But their cousins, maybe, their extended family." The local papers had recently reported unusual bear activity in the nature preserve. Bears that seemed curiously unafraid of humans while maintaining a respectful distance. Bears that showed no interest in garbage or other easy food sources. Bears that moved with purpose and displayed what one researcher had termed unprecedented social cohesion. In the months and years that followed, Emma's connection to the local bear population developed in ways that fascinated the scientific community. Dr. Collins, maintaining contact with the Bennett family, made regular research trips to study what she hypothesized might be a spreading phenomenon. Bears learning new social behaviors from each other, teaching their young an evolved approach to human interactions. Emma, growing into a thoughtful teenager with plans to study wildlife biology, became an unofficial consultant to the local rangers, helping to foster understanding rather than fear when bears were spotted near residential areas. The offerings continued to appear on their porch with uncanny regularity, seasonal tokens that seemed deliberately chosen for their beauty or uniqueness. "I think it's a language," she explained to a documentary crew that came to film the unusual phenomenon when she was 15. "Not words, exactly, but communication through objects. Symbolic thinking that we never believed bears capable of until now." On Emma's 16th birthday, she received an acceptance letter to a prestigious summer internship with a wildlife research center in Alaska. Her parents were thrilled but unsurprised. Their daughter's unique experiences and genuine insight had made her application stand out among hundreds of others. What did surprise them was what happened that evening, as twilight descended over their backyard. Emma, sitting on the porch swing reading through the internship materials, suddenly grew very still, her gaze fixed on the tree line. "Mom, Dad," she called softly. "Come here, but move slowly." They joined her carefully, following her gaze to the edge of the woods. There, partially illuminated by the porch light, stood a massive black bear with unusual silver markings on its chest. Not Luna, certainly, but bearing a striking resemblance that couldn't be coincidental. As they watched in astonished silence, the bear deliberately placed something on the ground at the forest's edge, then looked directly at them with unmistakable intelligence, before retreating into the darkness. When they ventured to the spot with flashlights, they found a weathered pine cone, identical to the one Emma had carried from their old home 500 miles away. "How could they possibly?" Olivia began, but couldn't complete the thought, the implications too vast for words. Emma, however, seemed unsurprised. "Luna's grand cub, maybe," she suggested calmly. "The same bloodline, the same memory." That night, as her parents discussed the inexplicable event in hushed tones in the kitchen, Emma sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, the old pine cone and the new one placed before her like pieces of a puzzle spanning time and distance. "Thank you," she whispered to the darkness beyond her window, "for understanding, for remembering." From the forest, a soft huffing sound carried on the night breeze. Not an answer, perhaps, but an acknowledgement of connection that transcended ordinary understanding. As Emma drifted to sleep that night, she dreamed of two tiny bear cubs shivering on a snowy porch, of her own small hands offering comfort without fear, of boundaries crossed and worlds connected through the simplest and most profound act of compassion. And somewhere in the vastness of the wild, bears carried the memory of that connection forward, passing it from generation to generation through means science was only beginning to comprehend. A testament to the enduring power of a moment when species recognized each other not as threats, but as fellow beings worthy of trust and capable of kindness. The summer Emma turned 22, now a graduate student in wildlife biology specializing in ursine cognition, she returned to the site of the original cabin for the first time since their move. The property had changed hands twice over the years, eventually being purchased by a conservation trust that maintained it as a field station for researchers. The director, Dr. Mason, welcomed her warmly. "We've been hoping you'd visit," he said as they walked the familiar path from the driveway to the cabin. "Your family's experience here was the foundation for so much of our current understanding of bear social cognition." Emma smiled, taking in the changes to the property. New outbuildings, research equipment, the expanded deck where once she had sat watching bear cubs play, while feeling the profound familiarity of the surrounding forest. "It looks different," she observed, "but it feels the same." "The bears are still here," Dr. Mason told her, confirming what she had already sensed. "Luna passed several years ago. She would have been quite elderly for a wild bear, but her descendants remain. They've maintained the unusual behaviors first documented during your family's time here." A lump formed in Emma's throat at the news of Luna's passing. Expected, but still painful. "Her family is still together." The director nodded. "The most stable bear social group ever recorded. They maintain a clear territory, engage in coordinated behaviors, and exhibit remarkable cognitive flexibility." He hesitated, then added more quietly, "And they still leave objects at the cabin porch." That evening, after settling into the guest room that had once been her childhood bedroom, Emma slipped outside alone. The forest welcomed her with familiar sounds and scents, stirring memories both vivid and distant. She made her way to the boundary between yard and wilderness, the invisible line where worlds had once intersected in ways that changed everything. Standing in the gathering dusk, she closed her eyes and reached out with that wordless communication she had first discovered as a child. Not calling exactly, but opening herself to connection. She wasn't sure how long she stood there, minutes perhaps, before she felt it. A subtle shift in the forest's energy, a presence that registered not through ordinary senses but through something deeper and more primal. Opening her eyes, she saw them. 3 adult bears at the forest's edge, watching her with the distinctive, focused attention she remembered so well. Though she had studied bears extensively in the years since, had observed hundreds in the wild across multiple habitats, there was something unmistakable about these particular animals, something in their posture, their gaze, their very presence that spoke of shared history. "Luna's grand cubs," she murmured, recognition flowing through her. "Or great-grand cubs by now." The largest of the 3, a female with markings eerily reminiscent of Luna's distinctive patterns, took a step forward. In the fading light, Emma could see she carried something in her mouth, a small object that she placed carefully on the ground before retreating to a respectful distance. Heart pounding, Emma moved forward slowly, maintaining eye contact with the bears who watched her approach without fear or aggression. At the spot where the object had been placed, she knelt down and found herself staring at a weathered blue fabric, frayed and faded, but unmistakable. a fragment of her childhood comfort blanket, the one she had given to the injured cub that extraordinary night so many years ago. Tears sprang to her eyes as she lifted the tattered piece of fabric, marveling at its journey through time and generations. How had they preserved it? How had they known to return it to her now, on her first visit back to this place of beginnings? "You remembered," she whispered, looking up at the bears who continued their silent vigil at the forest's edge. "All these years." As if in response, the lead female made a soft huffing sound, the exact vocalization Emma had studied extensively in her research, now understood to be a sound of recognition and acknowledgement among bears. The other two joined in, creating a chorus that resonated through the gathering darkness. In that moment, spanning the years between a child's innocent compassion and a young scientist's informed understanding, Emma felt the circle complete itself. What had begun as a desperate encounter on a snowy night had evolved into something science was only beginning to comprehend. A genuine, multi-generational connection between species capable of recognizing each other's personhood across the boundaries of form and language. That night, as she sat with Dr. Mason and his research team around the same fireplace, where once she had watched bear cubs sleep beside her, Emma shared the full story that had only partially made it into the scientific literature. The emotional truth behind the clinical observations, the profound sense of connection that had shaped her life's direction. "We've always suspected there was more to the account than what was documented," Dr. Mason admitted. "The behavioral patterns we observe in this bear population are too specific, too consistent to be explained by standard evolutionary processes." "Cultural transmission," Emma suggested. "Not genetic but learned, passed from generation to generation through observation and direct teaching." It was the focus of her graduate research, the hypothesis she had been carefully documenting across multiple bear populations that had experienced positive human interactions. "But even that doesn't fully explain what we're seeing here," countered another researcher. "The targeted behaviors, the object offerings, the multi-generational recognition of specific humans, it suggests levels of memory, symbolism, and intentionality we've never attributed to non-human species." As the scientific discussion continued around her, Emma found herself thinking not of data points and behavioral markers, but of a small bear cub with an injured paw, of her own tiny hands offering comfort, of boundaries dissolved through the purest form of compassion. Some connections, she had learned, existed in the spaces between established categories, in the undefined territories where science gave way to something older and more primal, a recognition of shared existence that transcended the limitations of different forms. The next morning, she rose before dawn and returned to the forest's edge, the fragment of a blue blanket in her hand. The bears were already waiting, as if they had anticipated her return. "Thank you," she said simply, addressing them directly as she had always done. "For remembering, for continuing what we started." With deliberate movements, she placed the fragment of blanket on the ground and added to it a small object from her pocket, a polished stone she had carried through her years of field work, a tangible reminder of where her journey had begun. The lead female approached cautiously, sniffing at the offering. Then, with surprising gentleness, she used her nose to nudge the stone and fabric together before looking up at Emma with eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of generations. No words passed between them, none were needed. In that silent exchange was everything: acknowledgement of shared history, recognition of separate but parallel journeys, affirmation of a connection that had defied explanation and transcended time. As the sun rose over the forest, painting the scene in gold and amber light, Emma Bennett stood at the boundary between worlds, bearing witness to the extraordinary legacy of one night's compassion. a legacy that continued to unfold in ways that reminded humanity of its place, not apart from, but deeply connected to, the vast web of conscious life that shared this planet. And in the gentle morning breeze, carried like whispers through the ancient pines, seemed to echo the eternal truth that had started it all, that sometimes the purest wisdom comes from the youngest hearts, that the deepest connections form in moments of greatest vulnerability, and that the simplest acts of compassion can indeed bring everyone, human and animal alike, to tears of recognition for our shared existence in this wild and wonderful world. 10 years later, the legacy of that extraordinary encounter had expanded beyond anything the Bennett family could have imagined. Emma's research, building on the foundation of her unique childhood experience, had revolutionized the field of animal cognition and interspecies communication. The Bennett Protocol, as it had come to be known in wildlife management circles, had transformed approaches to human-wildlife conflict resolution across North America and beyond. Based on principles of mutual respect and recognition rather than fear and dominance, it had resulted in dramatic reductions in negative encounters while fostering unprecedented coexistence in regions where human development pressed against wilderness areas. Now, Dr. Emma Bennett, 32, and the head of her own research institute dedicated to interspecies communication, stood before an audience of scientists, conservationists, and policymakers at an international conference. Behind her, a screen displayed remarkable footage from her field sites around the world. Bears, wolves, elephants, cetaceans, all demonstrating behaviors that challenged conventional understanding of animal cognition and communication. "What we're witnessing isn't anomalous," she explained, her quiet confidence holding the room's attention. "It's simply the emergence of capacities that have always existed, but that our own limited perspective prevented us from recognizing." From the back of the auditorium, her parents watched with quiet pride. Nathan, now semi-retired from his academic career, and Olivia, whose nature photography had become an integral part of their daughter's research, had witnessed the full arc of this extraordinary journey. "The most significant barrier to understanding animal cognition has never been the limitations of other species," Emma continued, "but the limitations of our own imagination, our persistent belief that human consciousness represents the only valid form of awareness and intelligence on this planet." As evidence, she shared long-term data from the original bear family, now in its 5th generation since Luna and her cubs, documenting complex social structures, symbolic communication through object exchange, and multi-generational memory transfer that defied conventional explanations. These behaviors suggest not just intelligence as we've traditionally defined it, but consciousness, a subjective awareness of self and others that we have too long considered exclusively human. The presentation concluded to enthusiastic applause, followed by a flurry of questions that Emma answered with the balanced perspective of both rigorous scientist and someone who had experienced profound interspecies connection firsthand. Later that evening, at a small dinner with colleagues and family, the conversation turned to the future implications of her work. "You've basically upended the entire field," remarked a senior researcher from Cambridge. "The philosophical implications alone will take decades to fully process." Emma smiled, thinking of those first moments of connection with frightened bear cubs on a snowy porch. How simple it had seemed then, before layers of analysis and interpretation. "Sometimes I think my 3-year-old self understood more instinctively what's taken me a scientific career to prove. That's often how the most important discoveries happen," her father noted. "The child sees clearly what the adult mind has been trained to overlook." As the gathering eventually dispersed, Emma found herself standing on the hotel balcony, gazing up at stars partially obscured by city lights. Her thoughts drifted to the bears at the research station, Luna's descendants, still maintaining their extraordinary traditions, still leaving carefully selected objects at the boundary between forest and human dwelling. Her phone chimed with a message from the station's current director. "Thought you'd want to see this right away." The attached video showed the newest generation of cubs, 4 of them playing at the forest's edge under the watchful eyes of their mother. What caught Emma's breath was what one cub carried carefully in its mouth. A small blue object that, even on the grainy footage, was unmistakably another fragment of her childhood blanket, preserved somehow through generations. "Impossible," she whispered, though she had long since learned that word had little meaning when it came to the depth of connection between her family and Luna's. A soft knock at the balcony door interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find her mother joining her, drawn by something in her expression. "Everything okay?" Olivia asked. Emma wordlessly handed over her phone with the video still playing. Her mother watched, eyes widening in recognition. "After all these years," Olivia breathed. "They're still passing it down." Emma nodded, emotions too complex for simple categorization washing through her. "It's like they're deliberately maintaining the connection, making sure each generation knows the story." "Isn't that what we do too?" her mother suggested. "Pass down our most important stories, maintain our connections to what matters most." The insight resonated deeply. Perhaps what they had witnessed wasn't so mysterious after all, not when viewed through the lens of shared evolutionary history, shared capacity for memory and meaning-making, shared need for connection across boundaries of all kinds. "I sometimes wonder," Emma admitted, "if what happened with Luna and her cubs was truly exceptional, or if it simply revealed what's always been possible between species when fear is replaced with recognition." Her mother considered this. Maybe both. Exceptional in that it happened at all, but revealing of possibilities that have always existed. As they stood together beneath the vast night sky, Emma thought of all the boundaries her life's work had helped to dissolve. Between human and animal, between science and empathy, between the child who had once offered comfort to frightened cubs and the scientist who now documented the rippling effects of that simple act across generations of bears and humans alike. And in that moment of reflection, she felt again what she had first experienced as a small child. The profound truth that compassion is not bound by the limitations of species or language or form, but flows freely between all living beings when we have the courage to recognize each other across the divides we have created. In the years that followed, Dr. Emma Bennett's work continued to expand, touching lives both human and non-human across the globe. Wildlife corridors were established in crucial habitat areas. Protected zones expanded based on new understanding of animal societies and their needs. Educational programs developed to foster empathy and connection rather than fear and exploitation. At the heart of it all remained the story that had started everything. 2 lonely bear cubs begging to be let into a human home, and a small child's act of compassion that had indeed brought everyone to tears and changed countless lives in the process. On Emma's 40th birthday, she returned once again to the original cabin, now the centerpiece of a thriving research station dedicated to interspecies communication. As she walked the familiar path to the forest's edge at twilight, she carried with her a simple blue blanket. Not the original, long since lost to time, but a symbolic recreation. At the boundary, where worlds had first intersected so many years before, she carefully spread the blanket on the ground and sat down to wait, opening herself to connection as she had done countless times across the decades. The bears came as darkness fell, not just 1 or 2, but an assembled group representing multiple generations of Luna's lineage. They approached with the measured confidence that characterized this unique population, maintaining a respectful distance while clearly acknowledging her presence. Among them, Emma recognized descendants she had known since they were cubs, now mature adults with offspring of their own, and at the front, distinguished by markings so similar to Luna's that it sometimes took her breath away, was the current matriarch, Luna's great-granddaughter, known to the research team as Stella. "Hello, old friends," Emma said softly, the familiar greeting she had used throughout her life. Stella made the distinctive huffing sound of recognition, echoed by several others in the assembled group. Then, with deliberate movements that spoke of intention rather than instinct, she approached the blanket where Emma sat and placed before her a small collection of objects. A perfect pine cone, a smooth river stone, a cluster of late summer berries, and, most astonishingly, a weathered scrap of blue fabric that Emma recognized instantly. The last fragment of her original comfort blanket, preserved through 5 generations of bears, returned now in what could only be described as a ceremonial exchange. Tears filled Emma's eyes as she gently accepted the offerings, understanding flowing between human and bear without need for words or explanation. In that moment, the artificial boundaries between species seemed to dissolve completely, revealing the deeper truth that had guided her life's work. That consciousness recognizes consciousness across all divides, that connection transcends form, that compassion creates bridges where none existed before. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything you've taught us." As if in response, Stella rose briefly to her hind legs, the same gesture Luna had used so many years ago, before settling back to all fours with a soft sound that seemed to carry all the wisdom of her lineage. That night, as a full moon rose over the forest that had witnessed the beginning of this extraordinary journey, human and bear sat in peaceful communion at the edge between their worlds. No scientific instruments recorded this moment. No cameras captured the exchange. It existed in the space between documented fact and lived experience, between the measurable and the profound. Yet, in that unrecorded moment lay the essence of everything Emma Bennett had discovered throughout her remarkable life's journey. That the most important connections often begin with the simplest acts of compassion. That boundaries between species, like all human constructs, dissolve when recognition of shared being takes precedence, and that sometimes the most profound wisdom comes not from years of scientific study, but from the innocent heart of a child who sees not differences, but only another being in need of kindness. As the bears eventually melted back into their forest home, and Emma gathered the symbolic offerings they had shared, she carried with her the knowledge that what had begun on a snowy night with 2 desperate cubs had evolved into something that would continue long after her own lifetime. A legacy of connection that would pass from generation to generation, bear to bear, human to human. A living testament to what becomes possible when compassion opens doors between worlds. And in the gentle night breeze that rustled through the ancient pines, seemed to echo the enduring truth that had started it all, that in a world too often divided by fear and misunderstanding, the simple act of opening one's door and one's heart to those in need can indeed bring everyone to tears, and in those tears transform everything. 5 years later, on the 20th anniversary of that first snowy night when 2 desperate cubs had appeared on the Bennett family's doorstep, a remarkable gathering took place at what had now become known in scientific circles as the Convergence Site. The original cabin, greatly expanded into a world-renowned research facility, hummed with activity as scientists, conservationists, indigenous knowledge keepers, and government officials assembled for a landmark conference on interspecies communication. Dr. Emma Bennett, now 45, and the recipient of numerous awards for her groundbreaking work, had been reluctant to host such a public event at the site she still considered sacred ground. But the importance of the occasion had eventually outweighed her reservations, 20 years of dedicated research building on her childhood experience had yielded results too significant to ignore. Results that challenged fundamental assumptions about the boundaries between human and animal consciousness. We stand at a crossroads in our understanding of what it means to share this planet, she told the assembled audience during her keynote address. The evidence we've gathered here and at similar sites around the world suggests that the capacity for meaningful communication across species boundaries isn't exceptional. It's latent in all of us, human and non-human alike. We've simply forgotten how to access it. As she spoke, screens behind her displayed remarkable footage from research stations on 5 continents. Bears in North America leaving symbolic objects at human boundaries. Elephants in Africa developing specific vocalizations to distinguish between threatening and non-threatening human groups. Cetaceans off the coast of New Zealand initiating complex interaction patterns with specific human researchers. What began with a child's compassion and 2 desperate cubs has revealed possibilities that are transforming our understanding of consciousness itself, Emma continued. But with this knowledge comes profound responsibility. Indeed, the implementation of the Bennett Protocol had sometimes proved controversial. While instances of human-wildlife conflict had decreased dramatically in regions where it had been fully adopted, economic interests often resisted the extensive protected corridors and interspecies communication zones it required. Some religious and philosophical traditions celebrated the dissolution of artificial boundaries between species consciousness. Others viewed it with suspicion or outright hostility. Nathan and Olivia Bennett, now in their 70s but still actively involved in their daughter's work, watched from the front row with expressions that mixed pride, wonder, and lingering amazement at the path their lives had taken. Beside them sat Ranger Morgan, long since retired, but still a fierce advocate for the protocol that had revolutionized wildlife management. Dr. Collins, whose early documentation of Luna's extraordinary behavior had provided crucial scientific credibility, nodded along as Emma addressed the remaining skeptics in the audience. We aren't anthropomorphizing when we recognize consciousness in other species, Emma emphasized. We're simply acknowledging what indigenous knowledge traditions have understood for millennia, that awareness, intelligence, and the capacity for meaningful connection aren't human monopolies but shared attributes of life in its many forms. As the presentation concluded and the audience broke for lunch, Emma slipped away from the crowd, making her way to the forest's edge where it all had begun. Despite the facility's expansion, this particular boundary had been preserved exactly as it was, the invisible line where a frightened bear cub had once touched a human child's hand and changed the course of countless lives. She sat on a familiar stone, breathing in the scent of pine and listening to the wind in the trees. 20 years of scientific rigor had not diminished her personal connection to this place and the beings who shared it. If anything, deeper understanding had only enhanced her sense of wonder. A soft rustling in the underbrush announced she wasn't alone. Looking up, she smiled at the approach of a familiar figure. Stella, now an elderly matriarch in bear terms, moving with the deliberate dignity of advanced age. Behind her came younger bears representing multiple generations of Luna's lineage, including cubs born that spring, who regarded Emma with the same curious intelligence she had come to recognize as characteristic of this remarkable family line. "Hello, old friends," she greeted them softly, the familiar words carrying across species boundaries with ease. What happened next was witnessed not only by Emma, but by a small group of conference attendees who had followed her at a respectful distance. Scientists who had devoted their careers to documenting the extraordinary phenomena that centered around this particular bear lineage and this particular human family. Stella, moving with careful precision despite her arthritis, approached the invisible boundary and deliberately placed a collection of objects on the ground, the traditional offering that had evolved into a complex symbolic language over the decades of interaction. But today's offering contained something unprecedented. Nestled among the familiar pine cones, stones, and seasonal items was a small object that gleamed unnaturally in the dappled sunlight. Emma's breath caught as she recognized what it was: a camera memory card, the kind used in the trail cameras that monitored the forest. With trembling fingers, she picked it up, turning to meet Stella's knowing gaze with astonishment. "Did you?" she whispered, unable to complete the question that challenged even her expanded understanding of bear cognition. One of the younger researchers stepped forward, her voice hushed with wonder. "Dr. Bennett, we've been missing that card for nearly 3 weeks. Camera 4 was damaged in a storm, and when we retrieved the equipment, the card slot was empty. We assumed it had been lost in the underbrush." The implications were staggering. For Stella to have not only found the card, but to have recognized its importance to the humans and deliberately returned it. This represented a level of conceptual thinking and cross-species awareness that exceeded even Emma's most optimistic hypotheses. As the news spread through the conference, reactions ranged from amazed excitement to stubborn skepticism. Some insisted there must be a more mundane explanation. Perhaps the card had simply been caught in Stella's fur and dislodged coincidentally during the offering ritual. Others recognized it as further evidence of what Emma had been documenting for years: that the capacity for symbolic thought and intentional communication in bears, particularly this lineage, had been dramatically underestimated. That evening, after recovering the data from the memory card, which contained valuable footage of bear social interactions rarely captured on camera, Emma addressed the conference again. The atmosphere had shifted from academic interest to something approaching reverence. "What we witnessed today challenges not just our understanding of bear cognition, but our conception of the boundaries between species," she said, her voice steady despite her continuing amazement. "Stella didn't just find a human object. She recognized its significance to us and chose to return it in a context of established communication." From the back of the room, a voice called out, an elderly indigenous knowledge keeper who had been observing the proceedings with quiet intensity. "Your science is just beginning to understand what our ancestors always knew," he said, rising to his feet with dignity. "The animals are people too, different from us, but people nonetheless. They have societies, languages, knowledge passed through generations. When we forgot this truth, we broke something sacred." His words resonated deeply with Emma, echoing conclusions she had reached through decades of scientific observation. "Yes," she acknowledged. "And perhaps what we're witnessing now isn't new learning, but remembering, on both sides." Late that night, after the formal sessions had concluded and most attendees had retired to their accommodations, Emma found herself unable to sleep. The day's events kept replaying in her mind, particularly Stella's unprecedented gift and what it suggested about the continuing evolution of communication between their species. A soft knock at her door revealed her parents, similarly awake and drawn by the same restless wonder. "Couldn't sleep either?" Nathan asked, his eyes bright despite his advanced age. Emma smiled, welcoming them into her small cabin. "Too much to process. Even after all these years, they still surprise me." "Us too," Olivia admitted, settling into a chair by the window that overlooked the moonlit forest. "I keep thinking about Luna, about that first night when we were so afraid to open the door. How differently everything might have turned out if we'd let fear guide us instead of compassion." The three sat in companionable silence for a moment. each reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had begun with such a simple choice. "I've been working on something," Emma said finally, moving to retrieve a tablet from her desk. A new hypothesis about what might really be happening, not just with Stella and her family, but potentially with all instances of evolved interspecies communication we're documenting worldwide. She showed them a complex diagram that mapped instances of advanced interspecies communication against geographical and temporal factors. There's a pattern emerging. The communication breakthroughs aren't random. They're clustering around specific locations and spreading outward, like ripples in a pond. Nathan leaned forward, his scientific mind engaged despite the late hour. "You're suggesting there's a geographic component? Certain areas where the barriers between species awareness are somehow thinner?" Emma nodded. "Not just geographic, also temporal. The frequencies are increasing at an accelerating rate, particularly in the last 5 years. She scrolled to another screen showing a sharp upward trend in documented instances. Something is changing, and not just in isolated cases like our bears. It's systemic. Or, perhaps, Olivia suggested quietly, what's changing isn't the animals but our ability to perceive what was always there. Maybe as more humans open themselves to the possibility of genuine communication, more connections become possible. It was a profound insight, one that aligned with Emma's emerging theory. That's exactly what I'm beginning to think. What if consciousness itself isn't confined to individual brains, but exists in the connections between beings? What if, by establishing that first connection with Luna's cubs, we didn't just communicate with individual bears, but somehow opened a channel that continues to widen? The implications were both exhilarating and humbling. If true, it suggested that the work they had been doing wasn't just scientific documentation, but active participation in an evolving network of cross-species awareness. As dawn approached, their conversation expanded to encompass the broader implications of what they had witnessed over 2 decades, not just for science and conservation, but for humanity's understanding of its place in the complex web of earthly consciousness. "I sometimes wonder," Emma admitted as the first light of morning filtered through the trees, "what Luna would make of all this. The research facility, the protocols named after us, the international attention. It started so simply, with cubs in need and a child who wasn't afraid." "I think she knew," Nathan said softly. "Not the details, perhaps, but I think she understood that something important had begun. That last day, when she looked back at us before leading her cubs into the forest, there was recognition there, an acknowledgement that boundaries had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed." The conference concluded the following day with the formal adoption of the Convergence Declaration, a document signed by representatives from scientific institutions, conservation organizations, indigenous communities, and government agencies worldwide. It committed signatories to implementing expanded versions of the Bennett Protocol, establishing protected communication zones at identified convergence sites, and incorporating indigenous knowledge traditions into scientific study of interspecies communication. As the last attendees departed, Emma found herself once again at the forest boundary, drawn by a need for quiet reflection after the intensity of the public events. The late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor, where generations of bears had left their offerings, and where a child had once reached out to comfort frightened cubs. A soft rustling announced Stella's approach. The elderly bear moved with the measured dignity of age, her once black fur now liberally streaked with gray. Behind her came bears of various ages, her daughters, granddaughters, great-granddaughters, and the newest generation of cubs, maintaining the extraordinary matrilineal tradition that had begun with Luna. Emma sat quietly as Stella approached the boundary, their eyes meeting in the wordless communication that had evolved over decades of interaction. In that gaze was recognition that transcended species, an acknowledgement of shared journey, of lives intertwined across boundaries of form and language. Without warning, a sharp crack echoed through the forest, the unmistakable sound of a rifle shot. Birds erupted from the trees in panicked flight as the bears startled, the younger ones moving instinctively toward the protection of the deeper forest. Emma leapt to her feet, heart pounding. "No!" she cried out, scanning the tree line frantically for the source of the shot. Stella, rather than fleeing with her family, stood her ground at the boundary, her attention fixed on something beyond Emma's line of sight. Following her gaze, Emma turned to see a figure emerging from the underbrush at the edge of the facility grounds, a man in hunting camouflage, rifle in hand. "Get away from those bears," he shouted, raising his weapon again. "They're dangerous." Emma moved without hesitation, placing herself between the hunter and Stella. "Lower your weapon," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone absolutely certain of her ground. "You're trespassing on a protected research facility." The man hesitated, clearly not having expected human presence so close to his target. "Those are wild bears," he argued, though he lowered his rifle slightly. "They don't belong this close to human habitation." "They belong exactly where they are," Emma countered, maintaining her protective stance. "This is their ancestral territory, and it's under international protection. Your presence here with a weapon is illegal." Behind her, she was acutely aware of Stella's continued presence. The bear had not fled despite the clear threat, instead remaining at the boundary, as if understanding that her role in this confrontation was crucial. The standoff continued for tense moments until the sound of approaching voices announced the arrival of facility security, alerted by the gunshot. As the hunter was escorted away, his protests fading into the distance, Emma turned back to Stella with a mixture of relief and amazement. "You didn't run," she said softly, kneeling at the boundary. "You knew, didn't you? You understood what was happening." Stella made a soft huffing sound, the vocalization Emma had documented countless times as an expression of recognition and acknowledgement. Then, with deliberate movements that spoke of intention rather than instinct, the elderly bear rose briefly on her hind legs in the gesture that had been passed down through generations of her lineage before settling back to all fours and slowly, with dignity, returning to her waiting family. The incident, disturbing as it was, provided powerful validation of Emma's work. The hunter, it emerged, had traveled from a distant state specifically to target what local rumors had described as those weird bears that act like people. Bears whose unusual behaviors had made them objects of both fascination and fear in some circles. The failed hunting attempt became international news, highlighting both the extraordinary phenomena occurring at the research site and the threats faced by animals exhibiting evolved behaviors that challenged human exceptionalism. Public reaction was overwhelmingly supportive of the bears and the research facility, leading to strengthened protections and increased funding for Emma's work. More significantly, Stella's behavior during the confrontation, her choice to stand her ground despite clear danger, her apparent understanding of Emma's protective stance, provided compelling evidence for the hypothesis Emma had been developing about the nature of interspecies consciousness. "It wasn't just recognition," she explained to her research team as they reviewed footage from the facility's security cameras. "It was collaboration." Stella understood that her presence was necessary to demonstrate exactly what we're protecting here. Not just individual bears, but the evolved relationship between our species. In the months that followed, Emma observed subtle but meaningful changes in the interactions between Stella's family group and the humans at the research facility. The offerings left at the boundary became more frequent and more complex in their composition, often including objects that seemed specifically chosen to communicate particular meanings, seasonal warnings about environmental conditions, indications of new cubs being born, even what appeared to be territorial information about other predators in the region. For her part, Emma began experimenting with more deliberate forms of response, expanding beyond the traditional acceptance of offerings to include symbolic communications of her own, arrangements of objects that conveyed information about human activities that might affect the bears, indications of changes in the research team, announcements of significant events. On a crisp autumn morning, 2 years after the conference, Emma arrived at the boundary for her daily observation session to find an unprecedented gathering. Not just Stella and her immediate family, but bears from multiple lineages, some related to Luna's bloodline, others representing different family groups that had gradually adopted similar communication behaviors, stood in a loose semicircle at the forest's edge. At the center, clearly positioned in a place of honor, was a very elderly bear that Emma had never seen before. Ancient even by bear standards, with a gray muzzle and cloudy eyes that suggested significant vision impairment. The assembled bears maintained a respectful formation around this elder, their behavior indicating a deference Emma had never witnessed so explicitly. "Who are you?" she whispered, observing from a careful distance so as not to disturb what was clearly a significant event. As if in response, Stella emerged from the group and approached the boundary, placing a single object on the ground with ceremony that could only be described as deliberate. When Emma approached to examine it, her breath caught in her throat. It was a fragment of fabric, faded, nearly colorless with age, but with a texture and weave that seemed hauntingly familiar. "It can't be," she murmured, carefully lifting the delicate scrap. But something in her knew with absolute certainty what she was holding. Another piece of her childhood comfort blanket, preserved somehow through all these years. Looking up at the ancient bear in the center of the gathering, a wild, impossible thought formed in Emma's mind. The timeline couldn't possibly work. Black bears in the wild rarely lived beyond 30 years, and it had been over 4 decades since that first night. And yet, "Luna?" she whispered, the name catching in her throat. The elderly bear's ears twitched forward at the sound, and despite her apparent visual limitations, she turned her head with precise orientation toward Emma's voice. For a breathless moment, human and bear regarded each other across decades of separate but intertwined existence. Then, with movements slowed by age but deliberate in their intent, the elderly bear rose briefly to her hind legs in the gesture that had been mimicked by generations of her descendants, the gesture that had become symbolic of the connection between their species. Tears streamed freely down Emma's face as understanding dawned. Whether this was truly Luna, somehow survived far beyond normal. Later, alone in her cabin, she carefully added the newly discovered fragment of her childhood blanket to the small collection of artifacts she had gathered over the decades, physical tokens of an interspecies relationship that had reshaped her life and countless others. Beside these personal treasures, she placed the draft of what would become her most important scientific publication, Convergence Theory, toward a new understanding of shared consciousness across species boundaries. In the conclusion of that groundbreaking paper, which would eventually lead to a fundamental reassessment of human-animal relationships worldwide, she wrote words that echoed back to where it all began. Perhaps the most profound discovery in our decades of research isn't that other species possess consciousness. Many have suspected this throughout human history, Rather, it's the recognition that consciousness itself may exist primarily in the connections between beings rather than solely within individual minds. If this is true, then every act of genuine connection across species boundaries doesn't merely recognize existing consciousness, but actually creates new forms of shared awareness, new possibilities for understanding that transcend the limitations of any single perspective. What began on a winter night with 2 frightened bear cubs and a compassionate child has expanded into a growing network of interspecies communication that challenges our most basic assumptions about the nature of intelligence, awareness, and connection. The bears have been our teachers as much as our subjects, showing us through their evolved behaviors that the capacity for meaningful communication across seemingly insurmountable divides isn't exceptional but inherent, a capacity we've forgotten rather than one we need to create. As we move forward in this emerging field of convergent studies, perhaps our greatest task isn't to teach other species how to communicate with us, but to remember how to listen to what they have been telling us all along. If only we had ears to hear and hearts open enough to recognize consciousness in its many forms. In the forest that night, under the same stars that shone down on the research facility, Stella led the elderly bear to a sheltered den prepared specifically for her comfort. Around them, members of multiple bear family groups maintained a protective perimeter, ensuring the ancient one's safety and peace. Inside the den, cushioned by fresh bedding gathered by younger bears, the elderly matriarch settled with a soft sound of contentment. Her long life had witnessed an extraordinary evolution, from the desperate night when she and her sibling had sought help from strange 2-legged creatures, to the gradual development of communication that had spread through generations of her descendants, to this final return to the place where boundaries between worlds had first dissolved. Whether this was truly Luna, somehow survived far beyond normal bear lifespan, or perhaps a daughter born soon after those events who had inherited both physical resemblance and cultural memory, the continuity she represented was undeniable. Through her lineage, the memory of compassion freely given had been preserved and elaborated upon, evolving into a cultural tradition that had reshaped the relationship between species in ways that continued to unfold. As night deepened, the ancient bear drifted into sleep, filled with memories both personal and ancestral, of a warm hearth on a snowy night, of tiny human hands offering comfort without fear, of boundaries dissolved and worlds connected through the simplest and most profound act of compassion. And in her descendants, gathered protectively around her den and spread throughout the forest, this living memory continued, a legacy as tangible as the genetic code they carried and as profound as the evolved behaviors they passed from generation to generation. Meanwhile, in her cabin at the edge of 2 worlds, Emma Bennett drifted into her own dreams, carrying the accumulated wisdom of decades spent building bridges across the supposed divide between human and animal consciousness. Her life's journey had begun with a child's simple act of kindness toward frightened bear cubs, and had expanded into a scientific and spiritual quest to understand the true nature of the connections between all living beings. As these 2 consciousness, human and bear, scientist and subject, connected across decades of shared history, dreamed their separate but intertwined dreams beneath the same canopy of stars, something continued to evolve in the space between them. Not just memory or understanding, but an emergent form of shared awareness that transcended individual minds and individual species, creating something new and profound in the world. A testament to what becomes possible when compassion opens doors between worlds. And throughout the forest and beyond, as this awareness continued to spread like ripples in a pond, echoed the enduring truth that had started it all, that in a world too often divided by fear and misunderstanding, the simple act of opening one's door and one's heart to those in need can indeed bring everyone to tears, and in those tears transform consciousness itself in ways we are only beginning to understand. 50 years after two bear cubs had appeared on the Bennett family's porch, as Emma celebrated her 70th birthday surrounded by family, colleagues, and students at the now internationally renowned Interspecies Communication Institute, a new generation continued the work she had begun. Her niece, Dr. Lily Bennett, had taken up leadership of the research program after Emma's semi-retirement, bringing fresh perspectives and new technologies to the study of what had come to be called convergence phenomenon. Under her guidance, the protocol first established with bears had expanded to include dozens of species worldwide: elephants, cetaceans, great apes, corvids. Even certain cephalopods had demonstrated capacity for evolved communication when approached with the principles Emma had pioneered. The fundamental insight remains the same, Lily explained to a group of visiting scientists as they toured the facility. Consciousness isn't confined to individual brains or bodies. It emerges and evolves in the connections between beings. Our work isn't creating these connections so much as recognizing and nurturing what was always possible. Emma, listening from her seat of honor at the gathering, smiled with quiet satisfaction. Her life's work had expanded beyond anything she could have imagined as a child reaching out to comfort frightened cubs, yet its essence remained remarkably simple: recognition of the other as a fellow conscious being, worthy of respect and capable of meaningful connection. The bears, too, had continued their extraordinary evolution. Stella had passed several years earlier, but her descendants maintained and expanded upon the communication traditions she had helped establish. Now, in their 7th generation since Luna, they displayed behaviors that continued to challenge conventional understanding of animal cognition. Complex symbolic communication, multi-generational knowledge transfer, cultural traditions that varied slightly between different family groups while maintaining core elements. Most remarkably, the phenomenon had spread far beyond this original population. Bears, hundreds of miles away, had begun exhibiting similar behaviors when encountering humans who approached them with openness rather than fear. It was as if a door, once opened, could not be closed again, as if consciousness itself, once recognized across species boundaries, continued to expand through networks not limited by physical proximity. That evening, as celebrations wound down and guests departed, Emma made her way to the forest boundary for what had become a daily ritual. Despite her advancing age, she still prioritized this direct connection that had been the foundation of all that followed. At the familiar spot where worlds had first intersected, she found the expected offering: the daily communication from the bear community that maintained links with the research facility. But today's arrangement contained something unusual. Centered among the traditional items was a small blue object that made Emma's heart skip a beat. Kneeling carefully, she examined what appeared to be a newly manufactured button. Bright blue plastic, clearly of human origin, placed with deliberate centrality in the arrangement. "What are you telling me?" she murmured, studying the composition for meaning. The answer came not in words, but in the unexpected emergence of a young bear from the forest edge, a cub no more than a few months old, distinctive in its unusually light-colored coat. It approached the boundary without hesitation, displaying none of the caution typical of wild bears, and fixed Emma with a direct gaze that seemed to look through her rather than at her. In that moment of connection, something extraordinary passed between them. Not just recognition, but a sense of continuation that transcended individual lifetimes. Whether through coincidence or some deeper mechanism science had yet to fully understand, this cub bore an uncanny resemblance to Luna's distinctive markings, as if genetics themselves had folded back to repeat a pattern from generations past. "Hello, little one," Emma said softly, maintaining the respectful distance that protocol dictated, despite her instinctive desire to reach out as she had so many years ago. "Welcome to the conversation." The cub made a soft sound, neither fearful nor aggressive, but inquisitive, then deliberately placed one paw on the blue button, establishing a connection between the object and itself that could only be interpreted as meaningful. A rustle from the forest announced the approach of the cub's mother, who emerged with the relaxed confidence characteristic of bears raised in this unique cultural tradition. She made no move to retrieve her adventurous offspring, instead watching the interaction with what appeared to be approval. The significance wasn't lost on Emma. This wasn't random behavior, but intentional introduction. A new generation being brought into the established channel of communication, ensuring continuity of the relationship that had evolved over 5 decades. As the cub eventually rejoined its mother and both retreated into the forest, Emma carefully collected the day's offering, including the blue button that seemed to symbolize something profound about the nature of the connection being maintained and renewed. That night, in the small personal journal she had kept since childhood, she wrote words that encapsulated a lifetime of discovery. What began with a child's compassion and a cub's trust has evolved into something science is only beginning to comprehend. Not just communication across species boundaries, but coevolution of consciousness itself. We have changed each other, bears and humans, in ways both measurable and immeasurable. And in that shared transformation lies our greatest hope for understanding what it truly means to be conscious beings sharing this remarkable planet. As she closed the journal and prepared for sleep, Emma's thoughts drifted to the image of the light-colored cub with its paw deliberately placed on the blue button, a gesture that seemed to connect past and future, linking the frightened cubs of that first snowy night with generations yet to come. In that simple moment of connection across time and species, she glimpsed the true legacy of what had begun so many years ago. Not just scientific discovery or conservation success, but the emergence of a new kind of relationship between species, one based not on dominance or fear, but on mutual recognition of shared consciousness and shared vulnerability. And as the stars wheeled overhead and the ancient forest breathed around the research facility that had grown from a simple cabin, the boundaries between worlds continued to dissolve, revealing the deeper truth that had always existed beneath the artificial divisions of human thinking. That consciousness recognizes consciousness across all divides, that connection transcends form, that compassion creates bridges where none existed before. In this continuing conversation between species, begun with 2 lonely bear cubs begging to be let in from the cold, and a human baby's simple act of kindness, lay not just a remarkable scientific story, but a template for how humanity might find its way back to genuine relationship with the more than human world. A relationship marked by recognition rather than exploitation, by connection rather than conquest. And in that possibility rested the profound hope that had sustained Emma Bennett through a lifetime of work at the boundaries between worlds, that what begins with compassion freely given might indeed transform everything, bringing tears of recognition to the eyes of all who witnessed the dissolution of boundaries once thought impermeable, and the emergence of consciousness shared across the glorious diversity of life's many forms. Emma Bennett died on a crisp autumn morning 3 years later, at the age of 73. Her passing was peaceful, in her sleep, in the small cabin she had insisted on maintaining at the edge of the research facility, as close as possible to the forest boundary that had defined her life's work. The morning of her memorial service dawned clear and golden, the forest ablaze with fall colors that seemed more vibrant than anyone could remember. Hundreds gathered at the Interspecies Communication Institute. Scientists, students, conservationists, politicians, indigenous knowledge keepers, all drawn together by the extraordinary legacy of a woman whose childhood act of compassion had transformed humanity's understanding of consciousness itself. As Lily Bennett concluded her eulogy for her beloved aunt, she gestured toward the forest edge, where for days an unusual stillness had prevailed. No bears had approached the boundary since Emma's passing. No offerings had appeared on the traditional communication site, as if the forest itself was observing a period of mourning. My aunt often said that true connection transcends not just the boundaries between species, but between life and death itself, Lily told the assembled mourners. She believed that consciousness, once shared, continues to evolve through networks that extend beyond our limited understanding of time and space. As she spoke these words, a murmur rippled through the gathering. Following the direction of suddenly pointed fingers and widened eyes, Lily turned toward the forest boundary. There, emerging from the trees in a procession unlike anything previously documented, came the bears. Not just a few individuals or family groups, but dozens, perhaps over 100, moving with deliberate ceremonial pace toward the edge of the human gathering. Old and young, from multiple lineages, they formed a semicircle at the traditional boundary, maintaining a respectful distance but clearly visible to all. At their center walked the light-colored cub Emma had first seen 3 years earlier, now a juvenile bear with striking resemblance to the long-ago Luna. Beside it moved an enormous male with distinctive silver markings, recognized by the research team as a direct descendant of Shadow, one of the original cubs from that snowy night. The human gathering fell into stunned silence, scientists and lay people alike witnessing something that transcended ordinary understanding. No one moved, no one spoke, as the assembly of bears settled into formation along the forest edge, their focus unmistakably on the memorial gathering. Then, in a movement that was captured on dozens of cameras yet still defied conventional explanation, every bear in the assembly rose briefly onto its hind legs, the gesture that had been passed down through 7 generations since Luna first stood at the Bennett family's door. They held the pose for several heartbeats, a forest of upright bears acknowledging the passing of the human who had first recognized their consciousness. As they settled back to all fours, the light-colored juvenile approached the boundary, carrying something in its mouth. With deliberate movements, it placed its offering on the ground, a complete blue child's blanket, newly manufactured, not a remnant or fragment. Lily moved forward, tears streaming down her face, and knelt to accept this extraordinary tribute. As she did, the young bear met her eyes with a gaze of such profound intelligence and emotional depth that no one present could doubt the awareness behind it. They understood, Nathan Bennett whispered from his wheelchair, his elderly voice breaking with emotion. All these years, they understood everything. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft sounds of weeping. Not from grief alone, but from the overwhelming recognition of what they were witnessing. Genuine mourning across species boundaries, deliberate acknowledgement of shared loss, continuation of connection despite death's supposed finality. When the light-colored bear finally turned and led the assembly back into the forest, the human gathering remained in reverent silence, forever transformed by what they had witnessed. In that extraordinary moment of shared consciousness, Emma Bennett's legacy was sealed not in scientific papers or conservation protocols, but in the living connection between species that would continue long after her physical form had returned to the Earth. The following spring, when the first research teams returned to the boundary after the winter pause, they found something unprecedented. The traditional communication site had been transformed by the bears into a permanent installation, a carefully arranged circle of stones surrounding a living sapling that had not been there before. Around this centerpiece, arranged with unmistakable deliberation, were offerings from multiple species. Not just bears, but wolves, ravens, even local deer had contributed items to what could only be described as a memorial. She always said consciousness exists in the connections, Lily explained to astonished colleagues. What we're seeing is the physical manifestation of a network that transcends not just species boundaries but the boundary between life and death itself. As the sapling grew over the years, eventually becoming a towering pine that stood as sentinel at the exact spot where worlds had first intersected, the Interspecies Communication Institute expanded its work to document similar phenomena worldwide. Convergence sites were identified on every continent, each with its own unique manifestations, but all sharing the fundamental principle Emma Bennett had first recognized: that consciousness recognizes consciousness across all divides when approached with openness rather than fear. On the 10th anniversary of Emma's passing, during a quiet moment at the now-established memorial site, Nathan Bennett, in his final visit before his own death, sat alone with his memories. At 93, his body was frail, but his mind remained clear, particularly when it came to the extraordinary journey that had begun that snowy night so long ago. As twilight gathered and staff prepared to help him back to the facility, he caught movement at the forest's edge. There, partially illuminated by the setting sun, stood the light-colored bear, now fully mature, its resemblance to Luna even more pronounced with age.